CD 10.
Anthropoid. 3 days before Christmas, 1941, twin-engine British Halifax flew out of southern England, flying low across occupied France and Germany to avoid detection. On board were 9 Czech and Slovak paratroopers, all trained by Britain's Special Operations Executive. Each of the men was kitted out with Czech-made suits, underwear, shoes, cigarettes, matches, and forged identity papers. Among the passengers were 2 best friends, Josef Gabčík, who was a Slovak, and Jan Kubiš, a Czech. No one else on board was aware of the dangerous mission entrusted to these 2 men by Czechoslovakia's government in exile, and neither man expected to survive it. The British and Soviet governments had for some time been pressuring Beneš to contribute more to the war effort, but resistance activity in the Protectorate had been smothered by Heydrich's campaign of terror. Beneš, who was embarrassed by the apparent passivity of his people, broadcast messages to Prague from London calling for more action. But many Czechs elected to accept the shame of captivity rather than risk a futile death at the hands of the Gestapo. With his people's reputation sinking among the Allies, Beneš approved a dramatic scheme that would erase the stigma of Czech passivity. They would drop Czechoslovak paratroopers into Prague to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich. The plan was wildly dangerous. No senior Nazi had ever been assassinated before. Beneš's spy chief, František Moravec, warned that retaliation from Hitler would be murderous. Nonetheless, Beneš gave the order to proceed with the mission, which was codenamed Operation Anthropoid. Gabčík and Kubiš were personally selected by Moravec and given special commando training in Scotland, and dropped along with the 7 other paratroopers into the Bohemian countryside. Gabčík and Kubiš made their way through the snow to Prague, where they were billeted with several families working with the resistance. For months, Gabčík and Kubiš monitored Heydrich's daily routine, looking for the ideal time and place to strike. Then, on the 23rd of May 1942, a crucial piece of intelligence fell into their laps. Josef Novotný, a Czech watchmaker, had been called into Heydrich's office to repair an antique clock. As he set to work, he noticed the Reichsprotector's itinerary sitting on his desk. Thinking quickly, Novotný screwed the document up and put it in the wastepaper basket. He repaired the clock and left the office. A sympathetic cleaner collected the precious document, and within hours it was in Kubiš's and Gabčík's hands. The itinerary revealed that Heydrich would be leaving Prague in 4 days' time, possibly for good, to take up a new post elsewhere in the Reich. After months of preparation, the assassins now had just 4 days to complete their mission. By now, members of the Prague Underground and their fellow paratroopers had figured out Gabčík and Kubiš's mission, and they fired off a protest to London, warning that the killing of Heydrich would cost thousands of lives. The reply from London was adamant. They were to proceed with the mission regardless of the consequences. Gabčík and Kubiš had accepted they were likely to be killed and made their farewells to their hosts. Gabčík had fallen in love with Libiana Favkova, the daughter of one of the families, and the 2 celebrated their engagement joyfully and quietly in her Prague apartment. On the morning of the 27th of May, Reinhard Heydrich left his mansion 14 kilometres to the north of Prague in an open-topped Mercedes cabriolet chauffeured by an oversized SS officer named Klein. Security was almost non-existent. Heydrich believed he had nothing to fear from the cowed people of Prague. The car passed through the northeastern suburbs on its way to Hradčany. As the driver rounded a hairpin turn, Gubčík strode out from behind a tram and stopped in front of the car, forcing the driver to brake hard. Gubčík flung aside his folded coat, revealing a Sten submachine gun. And at this critical moment, the gun jammed. The driver froze. An amazed Heydrich stood up from his seat and pulled out his pistol. As Heydrich took aim at the fleeing Gubčík, Kubiš ran up from behind and lobbed a homemade anti-tank grenade at the back of the Mercedes, which detonated under its rear fender. The explosion rocked the car, blasting shrapnel through the car seat into Heydrich's lower back. Full of fury, the wounded Heydrich staggered out of the car and chased after Kubiš, who took off downhill on his bicycle. After 20 steps, Heydrich collapsed from shock and blood loss. Lying on the ground, he ordered Klein, his driver, to go after the assassin. Pistol now in hand, Gubčík ducked into a butcher's shop. As Klein entered the shop, Gubčík shot him twice in the leg and made his escape, leaving the bodyguard groaning on the ground. Both he and Kubiš slipped into the streets and met at their rendezvous point, believing they had failed in their mission. Heydrich, meanwhile, was still lying in the street, bleeding heavily. A woman helped him into a Tatra delivery van and ordered the driver to take him to a nearby hospital. An X-ray revealed that Heydrich had suffered major damage to his spleen, one lung, and his diaphragm. But his wounds were treatable, and he was expected to recover. No one in Prague could fail to notice that something momentous had happened that morning. Within the hour, an apoplectic Adolf Hitler was on the phone to SS leader Karl Hermann Frank, demanding he execute as many as 10,000 Czechs in retaliation for the attack. Prague was completely sealed off. SS squads fanned out throughout the city, looking for the culprits. The Gestapo raided thousands of buildings, conducted house-to-house searches, but discovered nothing. Germany offered a reward of 1 million Reichsmarks for information on the assassins. Hacker's government doubled it. In hospital, Heydrich's condition stabilised, but 2 days after the attack, he became feverish as sepsis set in. Fragments of horsehair from the car's upholstery implanted in his abdomen had poisoned his blood. He needed penicillin. There was none to be had in the German Reich. Heinrich Himmler rushed from Berlin to the bedside of his dying lieutenant, who was resigned to his fate. He quoted a line from an opera written by his father, who had been a composer. "The world is just a barrel organ, which the Lord God turns himself. We all have to dance to the tune which is already on the drum." And Heydrich fell into a coma and died. Bernhard Werner, the detective sent from Berlin to investigate the assassination, thought that Heydrich's face, in death, possessed deceptive features of uncanny spirituality and entirely perverted beauty, like a Renaissance cardinal. The death in Prague of the blonde beast made front-page news across the world. President Hacha condemned the assassination and urged members of the public to come forward to help the police investigation. Benish's people in London denounced Hacha as a traitor and a quisling. The procession of Heydrich's silver and gunmetal coffin from the castle to the Old Town was hailed with Nazi salutes from onlookers. Newsreel footage shows crowds crammed into the Old Town square, with people climbing all over the Jan Hus monument to get a good look. In a close-up, one woman, presumably a German, is dabbing her eyes, while another's face is screwed up with grim satisfaction. The coffin was carried by a special train to Berlin, where the entire Nazi leadership, led by an emotional Adolf Hitler, gave their fallen Siegfried a hero's funeral. Heydrich was raised to the pantheon of the regime's exalted dead. Hitler swore to take revenge upon the assassins and to conduct mass reprisals against the Czech people. After weeks of house-to-house searches, the investigation had failed to identify, let alone locate, the culprits. False intelligence surfaced, linking the assassins to the village of Lidice, 14 miles northwest of Prague. On the morning following Heydrich's funeral, uniformed police and intelligence officers sealed off the village. Under Hitler's orders, 173 men from Lidice were taken to a farm and shot in groups of 10, while the villagers' houses were looted and burnt to the ground. The process took hours. Every woman in Lidice was deported to a concentration camp. The few children found to be worthy of Germanization were handed over to SS families. The rest died in the gas chambers with their mothers. The burnt-out remains of the village were bulldozed or blown up with explosives. Lidice was literally obliterated. Unlike other Nazi atrocities, the massacre at Lidice was proudly trumpeted by German propaganda, and the world recoiled in horror. The massacre at Lidice gave the war a deeper moral dimension in the eyes of people who had not yet been fully aware of the depths of Nazi depravity. Towns in Brazil, Mexico, the United States and Panama renamed themselves Lidice in sympathy. A settled view took hold in the Allied nations that a negotiated peace with the Nazis was impossible. The regime that destroyed Lidice must itself be destroyed. In Prague, the Protectorate authorities warned of harsher measures if Heydrich's killers were not handed over by the 18th of June. Rumours coursed through the city that the Germans intended to execute 1 in every 10 citizens until the assassins were identified. On the 16th of June, a young man named Karel Čerda walked into the Petschek Palace and told the Gestapo that he could help them with their manhunt. Čerda was one of the Czech paratroopers, dropped along with Gabčík and Kubiš. Whether he was motivated by a desire to forestall a larger civilian massacre is unclear, but he admitted after the war that the large reward was a factor. He told the Gestapo he did not know the hiding place of Gabčík and Kubiš, but he could direct them to several resistance safe houses connected to them, including the home of Alois and Marie Moravec in Žižkov. The Gestapo stormed into the Moravec family apartment before dawn. Marie Moravec managed to bite down on a cyanide capsule, which killed her within minutes. Alois and their son Ata were hauled into the cells of the Petschek Palace for interrogation. After hours of torture, the 17-year-old Ata was force-fed whiskey to make him talk. There is a story that Ata's spirit was broken when one of the interrogators presented him with his mother's severed head inside a fish tank. Ata gave his torturers the name of Gabčík and Kubiš's hiding place, the Church of Cyril and Methodius in the New Town. In the pre-dawn darkness, trucks carrying 800 SS men converged on the Orthodox Church between the river and the Charles Square. When the Germans burst through the door, Kubiš and 2 of his fellow parachutists were in the gallery over the nave, armed with Colt revolvers. They opened fire, shooting down every SS soldier that charged in. The three men held their ground for nearly 2 hours against grenades, guns, and automatic weapon fire, until Kubisch, severely wounded, put his gun to his head. The Germans prepared to leave, but then the discovery of some extraneous items of clothing in the church indicated there were more resistance fighters hidden elsewhere. A carpet was pulled back, revealing a trapdoor to the crypt, where Gabčík was hiding with 3 well-armed comrades, Walčík, Hruby, and Schwarz. The SS foot soldiers pulled up the trapdoor, but each one who tried to descend the narrow, winding staircase got his legs shot to pieces and had to be pulled out. A priest was ordered to shout down to them that they had nothing to fear and that they should give themselves up. "Never! Never!" was the famous reply from the crypt. "We are Czechs. We will never surrender. Do you hear us? Never!" By now, SS leader Karl Hermann Frank had arrived at the church and was screaming at his underlings to finish the job. They dragged a fire hose up to the ventilation window to flood the crypt, but the parachutists easily knocked it out with a ladder. The traitor Karel Čerda was brought up to the window to assure the men that they would be well treated if they gave up. The response was another burst of gunfire. At noon, 8 hours into the siege, the stone floor was dynamited to create an opening into the crypt. But by then, Gabčík and his friends had exhausted their ammunition and used their last bullets on themselves. The death of Heydrich's assassins was followed by another wave of reprisals. The families of the paratroopers and the priests who had given them sanctuary were murdered. Alois and Artur Moravec were deported to Mauthausen concentration camp, where they were executed. Hoping to avoid further reprisals against his church, the Orthodox Bishop of Prague took responsibility for the decision to hide the men, and his life too was forfeited. Bishop Gorazd was recognised as a martyr by the church. The traitorous Karel Čerda identified an underground radio group in the village of Ležáky, and that town too was utterly destroyed. Edvard Beneš never allowed himself to doubt that Hitler's bloody revenge had been a price worth paying. He believed that Lidice had given him a galvanising symbol of German wickedness and Czech martyrdom. The Czechs could now be portrayed as fellow sufferers rather than supine collaborators. "What the Germans are doing is horrible," he told the Prague resistance, "but from a political point of view, they gave us one certainty. Under no circumstances can anyone doubt Czechoslovakia's national integrity and her right to independence." By 1943, Nazi Germany was in retreat on several fronts. The massive Soviet counterattack after the Battle of Stalingrad was pushing the Wehrmacht back across its conquered territory in the east. Nazi propaganda no longer spoke of Lebensraum, but of a life-and-death struggle against Bolshevism for the soul of Europe. The possibility of defeat brought cold fear into the hearts of Hitler's quislings in Prague. With Heydrich dead, the Sudeten-born Karl Hans Frank became the real power in the land. Frank cancelled Heydrich's expensive and disruptive racial inventory in order to muster the Protectorate's energies towards total war on behalf of the Third Reich. Resistance activity dropped to negligible levels again. Seeing no way of expressing opposition, Czech people seethed with resentment. They had seen the Jews of Prague being rounded up and taken away. and naturally wondered if the same fate lay ahead for them. They awaited the day, not so distant now, when they might exact some revenge against the vicious, strutting Germans. Carousel. 2019. On this February morning, outside of Prague's Holešovice train station, I collect some hot coffee from a vending machine and then walk through the sleety rain to the bus platforms. The destination signs are not clearly marked, so I check the placard bolted onto a pole and see Terezin printed with a neat list of departure times underneath. After an hour-long journey through the Bohemian countryside, the bus drops me at a stop on the banks of the Ora River. Up ahead, I see Terezin's tall, slanted walls, surrounded by a gaping, empty moat, with just a thin streak of slushy water at the bottom. Terezin was built as a fortress in 1780 by the Habsburgs to secure Bohemia's borders against a Prussian attack. They named it Theresienstadt, after Empress Maria Theresa, but now it goes by its infamous Czech name, Terezin. The town is neatly laid out in a grid, with derelict Habsburg-era buildings that seem to be mostly uninhabited. It's mid-morning on a Saturday, but there's no one around, only the occasional passing car. The shabbiness of Terezin reminds me sharply of the communist era in a way that Prague no longer does. The window of a discount clothes store displays a single dress on a dusty, headless mannequin. Round the corner, a pawn shop opens its doors momentarily, and a couple emerge with an old portable TV set. The shopkeeper bids them farewell, then bolts the door shut. In 2001, a former Australian Prime Minister, Paul Keating, delivered a speech in Berlin at the newly rebuilt Potsdamer Platz. Keating, who was a lover of German music and culture, shocked his hosts by saying he thought the reconstruction of Berlin after the war was a colossal mistake. Keating said that the ruined city should have been left as an immense open-air museum, as a monument to false notions of glory, to nationalism, to idolatry, to racism, to political criminality. Berlin was, he said, what people in Australia might call, with reference to Aboriginality, an unsacred site. A site made sacred by its unsacredness. This place, Terezin, is such a ruin. It is a truly awful place. A town too airless to feel haunted. In October 1941, Terezin Fortress was requisitioned by Reinhard Heydrich to be refitted as a concentration camp for Czech Jews who would be held there until they could be transported to the death camps in Poland. Heydrich decreed that Terezin would also take in prominent Jewish people from the Reich, whose disappearance would be noticed by the outside world, decorated veterans of the Great War, scholars, artists and musicians. The SS brazenly advertised Terezin as a spa town, fit for a comfortable retirement. Many Jews in Central Europe willingly handed over their life savings in exchange for the promise of well-furnished private rooms with a lakeside view. There was no lake. Of the 141,000 Jews sent to Theresienstadt, 33,000 would die of overwork, malnourishment and disease. Another 88,000 would be shipped east to extermination camps like Auschwitz. The camp's population fluctuated wildly, depending on the timing of the transports. Susanna Justman, a child prisoner, remembers the streets of Terezin were so jammed at times she found it difficult to walk without bumping into anyone. But then a consignment of prisoners would be sent to an unknown destination in Poland, never to return, and the streets would thin out again. Between 1941 and the final transports of 1944, a kind of desperate cultural miracle unfolded here, as the influx of musicians, actors and scholars made the Jewish ghetto at Terezin briefly one of the richest cultural centres in Europe. The camp commandant, Karl Rahm, initially refused to allow prisoners to pursue cultural activities, but he relented when he realised that art and entertainment might make the prisoners more docile and less likely to panic when herded onto a transport. Soon there were public poetry performances in Czech and German. A distinguished rabbi delivered philosophy lectures to hundreds of inmates in a cramped garret. The actress Vlasta Shonova directed a production of Jean Cocteau's La Voix Humaine, while Prague's Puppet Theatre staged performances for children. An opera, The Emperor of Atlantis, was rehearsed but never performed due to the systematic removal of performers on the transports to Auschwitz. As newly arrived inmates lined up for their daily rations, some were amazed to find themselves standing in the queue behind a famous movie star. Kurt Geron was a moon-faced German Jewish actor and a cabaret performer who had starred alongside Marlene Dietrich in The Blue Angel. Geron had begun his career in Berlin's interwar cabaret scene, and he was the first man ever to perform Mac the Knife at the 1928 premiere of Brecht and Weil's Threepenny Opera. Geron made the jaunty murder ballad his signature tune. Kurt Geron's charismatic presence and his huge, roly-poly figure had made him one of the most popular screen stars in Germany, an instantly recognisable presence. In the early 1930s, he became a successful film director, which brought him wealth and power. Geron had refused to take warnings about the Nazis seriously. His friend, Peter Lorre, who had become a Hollywood star in Casablanca, tried to bring him to America, but Geron declined when he was told that first-class transport was not available. Geron fled to Paris with his family and then to Amsterdam, where he was arrested in 1943. A year later, he was sent to Terezin. In recognition of his abilities, Geron was invited by Commandant Karl Rahm to mount a show at Terezin. He devised a cabaret named Carousel and was rewarded with superior food rations, private quarters, and a promise of immunity from the transports. Geron often took to the stage himself, performing songs that obliquely touched on life in Terezin and the black hole that they might disappear into at any moment. The theme song to Carousel described life in the camp as a strange voyage, a journey without a destination. Carousel held more than 50 performances, but the production was controversial among the prisoners. Some saw it as a form of collaboration, aiding the Nazis by distracting the inmates. Others insisted that the cabarets were a consolation amidst all the terror. Troubled by reports of the mass disappearance of Jewish people within the Nazi-occupied lands, the International Red Cross demanded an opportunity to inspect one of the Reich's resettlement camps. Heinrich Himmler saw an opening for a propaganda coup, and he scheduled a Red Cross inspection of Terezin for late June 1944. Commandant Karl Rahm ordered a beautification campaign. Gardens were planted, buildings were given a coat of paint. Prisoners constructed fake shops, a fake bank, a fake school, and a playground to give an illusion of normalcy. The problem of visible overcrowding was quickly solved by the deportation of 7,500 elderly ghetto inhabitants to Auschwitz. The Red Cross delegation arrived at Terezin on the 23rd of June, headed by Maurice Rossel, a 28-year-old Swiss doctor who was led around the Potemkin village by Hram. The medicos observed a soccer game in the town square and a production of the children's opera Brundibar. Children were served a hearty meal, with a cucumber salad, chocolate dessert, treats that no one had ever seen before in Terezin. Paul Epstein, the Jewish mayor of Terezin, delivered a speech written for him by the SS. Epstein, who had a black eye from a beating administered to him by Karl Rahm, likened the camp to a pleasant country town. Despite the evidence of violence and the eerie, glazed expressions on the faces of the silent villagers, Maurice Rossel noticed nothing amiss, and he delivered an upbeat report. Life in the town, he wrote, was almost normal. After Rossel's departure, most of the children photographed in the report were transported to Auschwitz. The success of the ruse at Terezin emboldened the SS to attempt an even more grotesque deception. Kurt Gerren was called to Rahm's office and commissioned to direct a short film about the idyllic conditions at Terezin. The presentation was to be called "The Führer Gives the Jews a City" and would be shown in neutral nations to allay their concern about the treatment of Jews in the Third Reich. Gerren agreed to do it on the understanding that his life would be spared. Mortified inmates were once again conscripted to appear as joyful villagers. Only fragments of this film survive. Terezin appears as a model town. Young men play soccer in the sunshine. Women create pottery, while an artist moulds a fountain sculpture. A children's choir sings an oratorio by Mendelssohn. Inmates dressed in fine clothes watch a performance of Carousel, but under the close supervision of SS guards who were standing just outside the frame. Kurt Gerren's direction achieved uneven results. He confided to his cameraman, "I can direct the scene, but I cannot erase the horror from people's eyes." An inmate remembered Gerren pleading with his actors to laugh and smile, despite the presence of the SS. She said, "Bathed in sweat, Gerren urged us, implored us, begged for discipline, for us to follow orders absolutely. He cracked jokes, made despairing efforts. Please, no incidents. Don't provoke any use of force." He begged us urgently, "Do what I show you. When I laugh, laugh with me." And he began a contagious, irresistible laugh, during which he wobbled his fat belly, so he really had to laugh, even though the situation for him and for us was anything but laughable. Laugh, Pagliacci. As soon as filming was complete, transports to Auschwitz resumed. Kurt Gerren and his wife were among the deportees. Gerren was seen on the train platform, rigid and helpless, like a pillar of stone. He had to be helped onto the wagon. On arrival at Auschwitz, Gerren was sent immediately to the gas chambers. The next day, with the Red Army approaching, Himmler ordered the gas chambers to be closed. No angels. In February 1945, the big three Allied leaders met at Yalta on the Black Sea coast to discuss their plans for the post-war world. Churchill and Roosevelt were profoundly exhausted and far from their best. Stalin, for his part, made it clear that after the war, he wanted to establish a protective buffer between the USSR and the rest of Europe, a swathe of friendly states that he said must be free of fascist and reactionary elements. All three leaders understood this buffer would likely include Czechoslovakia. It would be up to Stalin to define what he meant by fascist and reactionary. Edvard Beneš had already concluded a mutual non-aggression treaty with Stalin. With the Red Army in control now of Eastern Europe, he knew the scope of Czechoslovakia's post-war independence would lie in the hands of the Soviet dictator. Beneš reasoned he should secure Soviet patronage sooner rather than later. Otherwise, Stalin might simply install someone like the communist leader Klement Gottwald as leader of post-war Czechoslovakia. Beneš, who had been so quick to grasp the true ambitions of Adolf Hitler, disastrously misjudged Stalin at this critical time. He persuaded himself that the war had tempered the Soviet dictator and made him more amenable to cooperation and coexistence with the West. Reaching out to Stalin, he hoped, might secure his generosity and allow Czechoslovakia to follow its own course after the war. In early 1945, with Nazi rule collapsing all over Europe, Beneš was ready to come home, but he would make his triumphant return to Prague from the east. He arrived in Moscow on the 17th of March, along with Jan Masaryk and the other members of his government in exile. Beneš believed the Soviet Union would offer his country the best protection against a revived Germany down the track. As a down payment, he would have to accept the loss of the easternmost point of the old Czechoslovakia, a sliver of territory known as Carpathian Ruthenia, to the Soviet Union. This would give the USSR a shared border with the new Czechoslovakia. In Moscow, representatives of the Czech political parties sat down with Klement Gottwald's communists and the Slovak National Council to discuss the shape of the new Czechoslovakia. Beneš wanted to stand above the fray, so he unwisely excused himself from their deliberations. This meant that Gottwald, not Beneš, chaired the meeting. The communists had arrived with an agenda, unlike Beneš's people, who hadn't bothered to draft a program of their own. They were faint-hearted Democrats at best, preoccupied by the need to punish the German traitors in their country to ensure that Germany could never again pose an existential threat to a Czechoslovak state. The desire for retribution kept Beneš's men looking backwards, while the communists kept their eyes on the future. So when Gottwald proposed a whole raft of radical economic and political proposals, they were waved through. Gottwald's communists got everything they wanted: nationalisation of the economy, the banning of the right-wing agrarian party, and control of the key ministries that would eventually allow them to introduce a police state. Jan Masaryk was to have the post of foreign minister, but a Slovak communist, Vlado Klementis, would shadow him as a junior minister. Beneš expressed some vague misgivings about the provisional government cabinet, but, keen to observe the proprieties, he accepted their recommendations. That evening, Stalin hosted a farewell dinner in the Kremlin. In one of several toasts, he tried to prepare them for the arrival of the Red Army in their country. "Do not judge them too harshly," he said. "They are tired by a long war and have become a little uncontrolled. Anyway, Red Army men are no angels." Red Army soldiers were young men, often from rural backwaters, who had been fed propaganda that told them the Soviet Union was the most economically advanced society in the world. As they entered the towns and cities of Poland, Germany and Czechoslovakia, they were dumbfounded by the prosperous farms with modern equipment, the urban centres with handsome buildings and indoor plumbing. The Red Army soldiers stole cars, rugs, bicycles, crockery, and above all, wristwatches, which became a portable status symbol. Some Russian soldiers were seen with 5 or 6 strapped to their wrists. The Russian troops treated women, particularly German women, in the newly liberated territories, as spoils of war. Their campaign of mass rape was the largest inflicted on Europe since the attack of the Mongol Golden Horde in the 13th century and constitutes one of the worst war crimes of the modern era. Soviet officers were either indifferent to such attacks or encouraged them. The consequences were predictable. Women committed suicide, many contracted venereal diseases or required abortions. The lingering effect of that campaign on the survivors and their families can hardly be imagined. Edvard Beneš arrived in the East Slovakian city of Košice on the 4th of April, where he swore in his new provisional government. Beneš, who was never a particularly charismatic figure, tried to rally the anguished and divided Czechs by appealing to their one shared passion, hatred for the Germans. Moving on to Brno, he delivered a speech asking for the nation's help to liquidate in its entirety the German problem. Beneš's advisor, Prokop Drtina, told a crowd of cheering Czechs that the ethnic Germans were a foreign ulcer in our body, which could no longer be tolerated. We must begin to expel the Germans from our land at once, immediately, by all methods. Ruda Pravo, the Communist Party newspaper, described the Germans as animals, without morality, without human feelings. Uprising. The final days of the war reminded Hedda Margolius of a passage through a long train tunnel. From far away, she wrote, you could see the light ahead, a gleam that kept growing, and its brilliance seemed ever more dazzling to you, huddled there in the dark the longer it took to reach it. But when at last the train burst out into the glorious sunshine, all you saw was a wasteland full of weeds and stones and a heap of garbage. Hedda Margolius was a Jewish woman who had survived Auschwitz and escaped while on a forced march to another camp. She had made her way home to Prague in secret, but found many of her pre-war friends were too frightened to take her in. Standing on the thresholds of their apartments, Hedda could see how ashamed they were of their fear. A friend who had once promised to be her anchor was tormented by her sudden appearance. He wanted not to know me, to know nothing about me, and live in peace and quiet in the middle of death and desperation. Still, she wrote, I believe that while he was talking to me, he realised that his calm was gone for good. Even if he were never to hear from me again, his life would not be the same. Hedda, exhausted and terrified, made her way from house to house. At one point she considered suicide. Eventually she was put in touch with the resistance, who found her an empty apartment in the affluent suburb of Device behind the castle. Hedda waited out the final weeks of the war there, while resistance fighters came and went, stashing weapons and bringing in wounded partisans. On the 30th of April, Adolf Hitler shot himself in his Berlin bunker. But Prague remained under Nazi occupation. 4 days later, word spread through the city that the Red Army had entered the country from the east and that the Americans were coming in from the west. The city readied itself for an uprising. Post office and railway workers tore down German signs and posters. Tram conductors refused to give change in Reichsmarks. The Nazi authorities stepped up security at the Czechoslovak radio building in Vinohrady, placing machine guns and coils of barbed wire at the entrance. SS reinforcements were set in, but the staff had torn down the German signs, and the SS men got lost in the corridors. They were unaware that for months the staff had been moving equipment out of the building to set up secret transmitters in preparation for the uprising. The next morning, on the 5th of May, Praguers woke up to see the national flag flying from public buildings. Switching on their radios, they heard the announcer speaking provocatively in Czech, not German. A contingent of loyal Czech police protected the radio staff as they secretly entered the broadcasting building from the back entrance or from the adjacent rooftops. At midday, the German-appointed radio director arrived at the building with troops to find that the staff had barricaded themselves inside. Czechoslovak and American flags were flying from the roof. SS troops exchanged gunfire with Czech partisans. At 12:33 p.m, the announcer broadcast an emergency message to the city, calling all Czechs, "Come and defend Czech radio. The SS are murdering Czech people here. Come and help us." Listeners could hear the sounds of combat in the background. The broadcast was heard across Prague as the signal for a general uprising. From her apartment window, Hedda Margolius saw civilians with rifles running down the street. Weapons caches hidden years before were dug up from under basements and garden beds. Secret depots in warehouses and factories were cracked open and guns passed around. The resistance sent bands of armed civilians to the radio building to support the embattled Czech police units. The SS troops were driven into the building's courtyard and basement, which was then flooded with fire brigade hoses. By mid-afternoon, the resistance had captured the telephone exchange, the post office, and the main train station. The fighting had spread all over Prague, but weapons for the resistance were in short supply. Hedda Margolius left her bolt hole in Davice to volunteer at a makeshift resistance centre in the basement of a cinema. She and another woman were entrusted with a dangerous mission to pick up a cache of weapons that had been stashed under the railway station 6 years earlier. Dressed as nurses, the two women made their way from doorway to doorway, avoiding gunfire. At the station, they spotted a large laundry basket with a red cross on it. They grabbed a handle each and hauled the heavy basket away. Once out of sight, they peeked under the sheet and saw a layer of bandages and medical supplies, and further down, a pile of guns. Rounding the corner, they were stopped by an armed German soldier. Hedda's companion dropped her handle in fright, and the basket hit the ground with a telltale metallic clank. Thinking quickly, she lifted the sheet and pulled out some bandages. Speaking German, she offered them to the soldier, who politely accepted them, and the women continued on their way with the basket. The end of the war was just days away, but 1 million or so German army troops, led by Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner, remained encircled within Bohemia and Moravia. Schorner ordered the Waffen-SS units still in Prague to hold the city at all costs. His army needed Prague's bridges as a retreat to the west, where they hoped to surrender to the Americans rather than suffer the vengeance of the advancing Red Army. But the Prague SS garrison found itself pinned down by resistance fighters who tore up cobblestones and constructed barricades with overturned trams, trucks, carts, mattresses, and timber beams. The resistance fighters were joined by rogue Russian units, led by General Andrei Vlasov, who had earlier defected to fight with the Germans, but now switched sides once again and supported the resistance with heavy weaponry. Confusingly, Vlasov's troops attacked German positions from German tanks, inscribed with "Death to Hitler" and "Death to Stalin." Artillery fire pounded through the city. Czech civilians lay dead in the streets. With just 2 days of the war left to run, the fighting had finally come to Prague. In the early hours of the 6th of May, 4 columns of Wehrmacht and SS troops from the outlying districts arrived in central Prague. At dawn, gun battles broke out in suburban streets. Several armoured vehicles rolled into Vinohrady to take back the radio building, but they were held at bay by the Czech militias. At the radio building, Czech partisans and police exchanged shots with SS units until late afternoon, when 2 Messerschmitt fighter bombers dropped a 250-kilogram bomb on the building. The explosion knocked out the radio transmitter, but the resistance was able to resume broadcasting just 80 minutes later from a new transmitter in Stražnica. As the fighting intensified across the city, an excited announcer broadcast a newsflash. The US Army had entered the country. Pilsen is occupied. British and American tanks are advancing towards Prague. The Americans had heard Prague's cry for help, but could do nothing. US General George Patton's Third Army had been given orders to halt at Pilsen, just 80 kilometres west of Prague. At Yalta, the Allies had agreed that the Red Army would drive the Germans from Czechoslovakia. But George Patton's tanks and troops had advanced more rapidly than expected, and the general wanted to push on to Prague. The British High Command repeatedly urged the Americans to let Patton's army liberate the capital rather than leave the job to the Soviets. Winston Churchill pressed President Truman to act. There is little doubt that the liberation of Prague by your forces might make the whole difference to the post-war situation, he said. The question was put in the lap of the Allied commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, who was advised, misleadingly, that the Red Army was close to Prague and didn't want their men killed in friendly fire. Eisenhower, who wanted to preserve American lives, decided he wouldn't sacrifice his troops for purely political purposes, as he said, and confirmed the order to stay in Pilsen. Patton still strained at the leash. 3 of his soldiers were sent into Prague to report on the state of the uprising. Dodging sniper fire, the Americans raced their jeep through the city, right up to the resistance headquarters in Bartolomejska Street, and brought one of their leaders, Captain Jaromír Nahansky, back to Pilsen. Patton was deeply moved by their report of the courage of the Czech fighters, and he pleaded with his superiors one more time to be allowed to liberate Prague. General Omar Bradley telephoned him to reinforce Eisenhower's decision. "You hear me, George?" Bradley said. "God damn it, halt." The next day, on the 7th of May, Hitler's successors surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. Even so, General Schörner ordered his troops in Prague to keep fighting until his army could make its escape to the American lines in western Bohemia. Meanwhile, the siege at the radio headquarters intensified. Resistance fighters coming and going from the building came under murderous fire from SS machine gun positions set up on the first floor of a nearby school. Within the radio building, a band of fighters volunteered to take out the nest of Nazi machine guns. The Czech partisans were joined by 2 British soldiers, Private William Grieg and Thomas Vokes, who had escaped from a nearby prisoner of war camp. The band of Czech and British volunteers made their way towards the school through a network of underground cellars, and they surfaced in an apartment block opposite the Nazi stronghold. Climbing to the top floor, they fired into the school windows across the road. The Germans refused to surrender and returned fire. The resistance fighters were badly outgunned. Several of the men were shot. There was talk of abandoning their mission, but then Thomas Vokes came up with a new plan. Knowing the Germans were desperate to avoid falling into the Red Army's hands, Vokes suggested that they bluff the Germans into surrendering to the British Army instead. In a nearby house, a Czech woman cleaned and pressed their uniforms into a near-pristine state. Then, accompanied by 2 Czech commanders, the sharply kitted-out British soldiers approached the school under the cover of a white flag, striding forward with as much coolness and authority as they could manage. Inside the building, Grieg informed the SS commanding officer that a British parachute division had already entered the city and that a combined invasion force was just hours away. Vokes warned the SS commander that unless he surrendered right now, he and his men would be completely destroyed. The commander signed the surrender document at 11:40 a.m. agreeing to abandon the school. In addition, he handed over a carload of Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, guns and ammunition to the Czech fighters. Elsewhere in the city, panicked SS men ran wild, shooting groups of civilians and plundering their houses. Waffen-SS units used Czech civilians as human shields for their tanks. Czech guerrillas retaliated with random killings of anyone they deemed to be German or a German sympathiser. SS armoured units set up positions in the old town square to shell a resistance cell that was operating down in the ancient catacombs of the town hall. The tanks opened fire on the medieval building, shattering the north and east wings, setting the astronomical clock ablaze, along with its painted calendar dial and wooden statues. Thick black smoke floated up past the teen church spires. By the following morning, the astronomical clock was a blackened ruin. On the 8th of May, the Prague uprising entered its third day as the Germans resumed bombarding resistance positions around Prague. The desperate Czech partisans were running out of ammunition. The Red Army had not yet arrived. The Americans weren't coming. Prague's historic centre was in danger of being blown apart by German artillery and aerial bombardment. General Rudolf Toussaint, the last German military commander of Prague, was desperate too and ready to cut a deal with the Czech resistance. At 10 a.m, he was picked up in Malá Strana by 3 Czech partisans. He was blindfolded with a tattered piece of a swastika flag and driven to the resistance headquarters. Toussaint made his offer to the resistance leaders. He would surrender the city if they would allow his soldiers to depart unharmed the following morning. After hours of negotiation, Toussaint signed the surrender. "Who am I now?" Toussaint muttered. "A general without an army. All I can do is go home and sit in the ditch and look at the blue sky." The Germans had lost another war. "We deserved it," Toussaint told his hosts. The next morning, on the 9th of May, a convoy of German armoured vehicles and trucks roared out of Prague. The city at last fell into silence, broken only by the occasional crack of gunfire from a few isolated pockets of SS men. More than 1,600 Czechs had died in the uprising, with thousands more injured. That afternoon, a column of Soviet tanks was spotted on the outskirts of Prague. A radio reporter went out to ride alongside the liberators. "We are coming down the winding hill from the castle," he told his listeners excitedly. "On the left is Klarov, on the right Hradčany, and before us a city is spreading out whose joy reaches the stars. At this moment, the Red Army has liberated Prague." Hedda Margolius came out to witness the entry of the Soviet troops. "People streamed into the streets to cheer," she wrote, "to welcome, to embrace their liberators, asking them into their homes, offering them every good thing they had. Pretty girls covered the tanks with flowers and climbed onto the armoured trucks. The Russians laughed good-naturedly and took out their accordions. The world was full of fragrance and music and joy." At sunset, Hedda walked through Malá Strana to the Klarov Bridge and looked out at the peaceful city spread out before her. There was no one around. At the entrance to the bridge, Hedda saw the corpse of a uniformed SS man lying on the cobblestones in a pool of black blood. She looked down at the now harmless creature and thought to herself, "Now, at this moment, and on this spot, the war is over, because he is dead, and I am alive." Wild transfer. President Benesch and his wife Hannah made their triumphant return to Prague on the 16th of May 1945. In this season of liberation, dazzling spring weather broke out over the city. The cherry trees on Petrine Hill and Letna Park came into blossom. The theatres, concert halls and the university opened their doors once more. From a high window at the castle, Beneš took a moment to survey his still intact capital with satisfaction. "Is it not beautiful?" he said. "The only Central European city not destroyed, and it was all my doing." He had convinced himself he had done the right thing after all in surrendering to the Munich ultimatum. Czech filmmakers produced a propaganda documentary with the help of the British and Soviet authorities titled "We Shall Keep Faith." The film opened with a sunlit view of T.G. Mazaryk's study, followed by footage of Beneš at his funeral in 1937, pledging to remain true to the great man's vision for the nation. The film offered a comforting narrative of restoration, but a return to the status quo antebellum was impossible. The founder's dream of a tolerant, multi-ethnic republic was gone for good. The war had carried the Czech people too far from his values, and there was no way back. Przemysl Pitta, a Christian pacifist, observed, "The waters have receded. The earth remains covered with dirt." In the West, people had taken comfort in the thought that democracy and human decency had prevailed over Nazi wickedness. The Americans and the British could reassure themselves that some mysterious process of cosmic justice had lent strength to their armies. But a great many Czechs had arrived at the opposite conclusion. They had seen their democratic values, their humanism, overpowered by the Nazi juggernaut. Czechs now knew, in their bones, the cynical truth of Lenin's famous maxim, "Sto stovo," which literally means whom. The whole question of politics and power is who will prevail over whom. Beneš's aide, Prokop Drtina, had absorbed this logic of might makes right when he proclaimed it was now the turn of the Czechs to prevail over the Germans. "One of us must leave," he said, "either the Germans or us. And since this is a Czech country and we are the winners, they are the ones to go." Hitler had poisoned the well of coexistence, and he had been cheered on by too many local Germans. Czech self-righteousness justified the seizing of property that didn't belong to them and deflected attention from their own collaboration with the Nazi authorities. The new government resolved that the local Germans be divided into 3 categories. Those guilty of crimes against the Republic were to be expelled or put on trial. Germans who had actively opposed the Nazis could stay, and the rest would need to reapply for citizenship. It would have taken a statesman of exceptional ability and moral authority to reconcile the two peoples and guide the Republic back to a peaceful, if uneasy, form of coexistence. But Edvard Beneš, who was never an inspiring leader, wasn't up to the job and didn't want to do it anyway. In Brno, he had called on his people to avenge themselves. "The German people," he said, "ceased to be human in this war and behaved like a monster. Their nation must pay for this with a severe punishment. We must liquidate the German problem definitively." This was an act, that he hinted darkly, that would require the combined strength of everyone. Heeding this incitement to violence, Czechs took matters into their own hands in a 3-month outbreak of ethnic cleansing, a period known as the Wild Transfer. In this lawless environment, the Bohemian Germans faced a terrible and final nemesis, as the vengeful Czechs held them responsible, collectively, for the crimes of the Nazis. In Prague, on the 9th of May, thousands of German residents were ordered to pack a suitcase and assemble in Strassmayer Square, where men with buckets of paint daubed swastikas on their coats and luggage. From there they were led into a nearby cinema and held captive for several days. Soviet soldiers made repeated visits in the darkness of the cinema, selecting women by torchlight to be raped and helping themselves to watches and jewellery. Dr. Friedrich Korkisch, a law academic, was at home with his wife when two Czech partisans came to their apartment and ordered them to leave at gunpoint. A truck was waiting outside for them. The couple were told they could take with them only what they could carry. They were both elderly, so a Czech neighbour carried an extra suitcase for them. Outside their door, a jeering crowd had assembled. The cry went up that the Czechs should not be bag carriers for Germans, so the helper went back inside with the suitcase. Someone punched the doctor in the head. Korkisch and his wife were sent to Týnitz near Český Brod, to a camp where Germans were routinely worked to death as farm labourers. Nearly every prisoner suffered typhus or malnutrition. Korkisch estimated the death rate for the year at 40 to 50%. Despite their advanced age, he and his wife survived, and after 2 years at the camp, they were expelled into the American occupation zone of Germany. They never saw their apartment in Prague again. The humanitarian crisis created by the wild transfer was raised at the Allies' Potsdam conference in mid-July. Winston Churchill expressed his grave concern, while the US President, Harry Truman, wondered how all the ethnic Germans could be accommodated in a devastated Germany. The leaders accepted that deportations would go ahead, but should be temporarily suspended, while the Allies prepared their respective zones of occupation in Germany to receive the refugees. By the end of 1946, nearly 3 million ethnic Germans, mostly from the Sudetenland, had been expelled into the American and Soviet occupation zones. The estimated death toll of the transfers varies wildly. Early estimates placed it at around 270,000 people. More recent research puts the figure much lower, at between 24,000 and 40,000, which includes suicides and unexplained deaths. Stripped of their property and most of their possessions, the survivors would have to restart their lives in a defeated country, struggling with food and housing shortages. The soft bitterness of life. Nazi war criminals and collaborators now faced a grim future, or no future at all. SS Commandant Karl Hermann Frank was picked up by the US Army in Western Bohemia. 8,000 spectators gathered in the courtyard of Pankratz prison to witness his hanging. Among them were relatives of those killed at Lidice. Konrad Henlein surrendered to Patton's army in Pilsen, where he took his own life by slashing his wrists with a concealed razor blade. Karel Čerda, the Czech paratrooper who had betrayed Heydrich's assassins, was tried and convicted of high treason. Asked by the judge how he could have betrayed his friends, he replied, "I think you would do the same for 1,000,000 marks, Your Honour." He too was executed in Pankratz prison on the 29th of April 1947. Lida Barova, at war's end, was taken into custody and sentenced to 2 years' prison for collaboration. Her affair with Joseph Goebbels destroyed her family. Her mother died of a heart attack under interrogation by Czech police. Her sister, Zorka Janu, who was also an actress, was blacklisted from the theatre. Deeply depressed, she jumped from a window to her death. On her release from prison, Leda married a young actor, Jan Kopecki, and the couple slipped across the border into Austria. In Salzburg, she found work as a barmaid at the Café Mozart, where she received high tips from customers, astonished to be served by a movie star. Leda resumed her film career in the 1950s, acting in several Spanish and Italian films, including Fellini's I Vitelloni. She took on stage work, but the odium of her Nazi past still clung to her. At the Graz Theatre, she was met with egg-throwing protesters. She wrote one memoir called Escapades, and then another called The Soft Bitterness of Life, which contradicted several of the claims in the earlier one. Leda kept no memorabilia of her time with Goebbels. "I've torn up all my pictures of us," she said irritably in her later years. "Thanks to him, I fell into the depths of hell." At other times, she claimed to be unrepentant about the affair. When asked to reflect on Nazi war crimes, Leda just shrugged. "I feel indifferent. I just want to forget the whole episode." Interregnum. Post-war Czechoslovakia had become, as Beneš hoped, a much more homogeneous nation. The Czechs and Slovaks now had a nation to themselves, almost entirely free of Germans, ethnic Hungarians, and Ruthenians. Before the war, Germans had comprised 29% of the population of Bohemia and Moravia. By 1950, they accounted for less than 2%. The Jews of Prague had been almost entirely annihilated. Of the 56,000 who were living in Prague at the start of the war, only 424 had survived, are remaining in hiding, protected by Czech and German friends. The old new synagogue was still there, as was the ancient cemetery, but there were too few of the living to sustain a congregation. 1,000 years of Jewish philosophy, literature, folklore, commerce, and conversation fell into silence. If the multi-ethnic flavour of the old republic was largely gone, its democratic spirit was badly wounded too. The destruction of Masaryk's idealistic republic had induced a kind of moral disorientation. Some turned to the church, but for many, communist ideology offered a more compelling explanation for what had gone wrong, and a seemingly rational alternative to weak-kneed liberal democracy. For them, the problem had not been Hitler, nor the war, nor the depression that preceded it, but the whole broken system that had produced these monsters. Becoming a communist allowed Czechs to draw a line under the catastrophe of the past decade, to dedicate themselves to a nation-building project, and to face the future with optimism. Hedda Margolius, now reunited with her husband, Rudolf, was torn between her loyalty to Masaryk's bourgeois democracy and the persuasive arguments made by friends who came to their apartment to make the case for a communist future. After hearing the arguments from both sides, Rudolf presented Hedda with 2 application forms for the Czechoslovak Communist Party. US diplomat George Kennan, now based in Moscow, wrote to a colleague that the Soviets saw only vassals and enemies, and the neighbours of Russia, if they do not wish to be the one, must reconcile themselves to being the other. President Beneš, nonetheless, remained confident that by embracing the Soviet Union, he had won some leeway to re-establish his republic as a bridge between East and West. Winston Churchill, however, realised that being in the Soviet camp put Czechoslovakia on the far side of an impenetrable barrier. In his famous Iron Curtain speech of 1946. Churchill listed Prague as one of the famous cities, now subject to a very high and in many cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. 2 months after Churchill's speech, the Czechoslovak communists won a plurality of seats in the parliamentary elections, but fell short of a majority. Gottwald became Prime Minister, and the communists took over the critical ministries of Information, Finance and the Interior, which gave them control of the police. Worried Democrats were reassured by the presence of Jan Masaryk in the cabinet, who stayed on as Foreign Minister. But the Interior Minister, Václav Nosek, created several new agencies, including the State Security Police, the STB, which soon began targeting opponents of the Communist Party. Any lingering hopes that Beneš and Jan Masaryk might have held that they could entertain close relations with both Washington and Moscow were dispelled in 1947 when Stalin quashed their plans to participate in the Marshall Plan, an American proposal to revive Europe's ailing economies with a massive aid program. The scale of the aid was unprecedented, and Europe's governments scrambled to take up the offer. The Czechoslovak government had enthusiastically accepted an invitation to attend a conference in Paris to discuss the program. But as they prepared to go, Masaryk and Gottwald were summoned to an urgent late-night meeting in the Kremlin, where Stalin told them the American offer was an anti-Soviet plot and they should keep out of it. If you go to Paris, Stalin warned, you will show that you want to cooperate in an action aimed at isolating the Soviet Union. Masaryk said he couldn't see the logic in his objections, but Stalin calmly directed their attention to a nearby map of Europe and said it would be a shame if Czechoslovakia ever had to face Germany alone again. After that chilling warning, the discussion moved on to finding a face-saving way of backing out of the Paris talks. Masaryk told several friends on his return, "I went to Moscow as the foreign minister of an independent sovereign state. I returned as a lackey of the Soviet government."
This is the end of CD 10. The book continues on CD 11. CD 11.
The refusal to accept Marshall Plan aid led to a slump in the popularity of the Communist Party. An opinion poll run by the Interior Ministry predicted the party would lose as many as a quarter of its seats in the upcoming parliamentary elections, scheduled for May 1948. While President Beneš officially remained above the politicking, privately he happily predicted the Communists would lose and that they would have to take a back seat in the new government. Beneš was, as usual, optimistic that democracy could be sustained. But the Democrats in his government were troubled by reports that the Communists were seizing power by stealth, stacking the police force with party members. Tensions increased on the 10th of September 1947 when 3 non-communist ministers, including Jan Masaryk, received package bombs in the mail. The explosives failed to detonate and no one was hurt. The terrorists were identified as Communist Party members led by Gottwald's son-in-law, but the trial was held off until the following year when the charge was thrown out. In February 1948, the non-communist ministers clashed in cabinet with Interior Minister Nosek over reports that 8 divisional police commanders had been replaced with party loyalists. The cabinet meeting almost ended in a fist fight. The Democratic ministers decided to bring on a showdown. They threatened to resign en masse, expecting that the crisis would bring down the government and force an election that would expose the communists' weak public standing. It was at this moment that a tragic misunderstanding arose between the president and the Democrats who needed his leadership. Edvard Beneš's health was failing. The president had suffered a series of strokes that left him struggling to speak and write clearly. When the delegation of Democratic ministers came to the castle to discuss their plan, they couldn't help but notice the president's confusion. Beneš told them to stand firm, but did not give any clear assurances as to what would happen should the ministers leave the government. On Friday, the 20th of February, 12 ministers submitted their resignations in the expectation that the president would call parliamentary elections to break the deadlock. But they were one minister short. The Constitution required the resignation of half the 26 cabinet members to trigger an election, and Jan Masaryk had begged off, citing a bad cold. The Social Democrats declined to resign. The anti-communists couldn't count, and Gottwald was ready for them. "I knew I'd get them in the end," he said, "but I never thought they'd hand me their asses to kick on a platter." Gottwald rushed to the castle and told Beneš he must accept the resignations and appoint replacement ministers. The Democratic ministers had left Beneš in an impossible position. The failure to take half the cabinet forced the president to deal with the prime minister he had and gave him no legal latitude. The president said he would consider Gottwald's proposal. Throughout that weekend, the dissenting ministers dithered, while the foreign minister remained in bed. Masaryk might have feared provoking a civil war or a Soviet invasion. Perhaps he was simply exhausted, like Beneš, and unable to rouse himself to the emergency. Gottwald mobilised his forces. Guns were distributed to workers' militia groups who marched through the streets of Prague and stood guard at public buildings. Newspapers sympathetic to the communists ran headlines blasting the 12 Democratic ministers as traitors in the pay of foreign imperialists. State radio urged workers to rise up to defend Gottwald's government. Defence Minister Ludvík Svoboda addressed the Communists' Central Action Committee and assured it that the army would always remain loyal to the people. Beneš tried to play for time, but the following day, more than 2 million citizens took part in a national general strike in support of Gottwald. A counter-protest by pro-democracy students failed to make an impression on the president, who had already decided to bow to the pressure. On the afternoon of the 25th of February 1948, Klement Gottwald, accompanied by the party's General Secretary, Rudolf Slansky, arrived by car in Wenceslas Square to address a cheering crowd of party supporters. Wearing a woolen Russian hat, Gottwald grinned as he gave the crowd the stunning news, but he was drunk and slurred his words. "I have just come from the castle, where I have seen the President of the Republic, and I can tell you that he has accepted all of my proposals without making any changes." This was, he said, the defeat of reaction and the victory of the working people. Hedda Margolius was watching from the window of the publishing house where she worked as an art editor. Her boss, standing beside her, softly said, "This is a day to remember. Today, our democracy is dying." 2 days later, President Beneš swore in the new ministers. Jan Masaryk was asked to stay on as foreign minister, but otherwise Gottwald's government was entirely dominated by communists or fellow travellers. Author Graham Greene happened to be in Prague, visiting his publisher just as the coup was taking place. Arriving well after midnight, Green discovered that all the restaurants in Prague were closed, but the porter told him the hotel staff were having a party in the basement and there would be food there. Downstairs, Green found the party in full swing. He saw the Venezuelan ambassador dancing with the cook. Other diplomats were drinking with the pastry chefs and the chambermaids. If this was really a revolution, he thought, it seemed to me not so bad. The next day, Green noted the parades and the shouting in the street. The joyful impression from the late-night party dimmed, and he noticed the bitter humour of defeat was circulating. Green visited his publisher twice. On the second occasion, he saw an armed sentry at the door. Soon afterwards, the publisher was arrested and disappeared into prison for a decade. The communist victory changed the face of the city almost instantly. Windows were adorned with red flags. Victory processions pounded through the streets. Stalin's picture was hung in every classroom, and a banner was draped over Wenceslas Square proclaiming, "With the Soviet Union forever." The authorities swiftly closed the borders. Former ministers found themselves shadowed by a secret policeman. Beneš did not stand down, but after having sworn in the new ministry, he left for his home in the countryside in protest. He never returned to Prague Castle. One by one, the new regime replaced members of Beneš's staff with communist loyalists who kept a close eye on him. His health deteriorated further. On the 12th of March, a friend noticed that Beneš had suffered another stroke. His eyes were watery and fearful, and he moved like a puppet damaged by a child. The ministers had been too dependent on Beneš, but ultimately, responsibility for the failure to defend Czechoslovak democracy rested with him. He had observed the constitutional proprieties too narrowly. This was not a contest between parties acting in good faith, but a fight against an external threat to the democracy that had been entrusted to his care. In acting too correctly, he had handed power to a clique of fifth columnists acting on behalf of a foreign power. And Beneš had given legal sanction to a communist coup d'etat. Democracy was finished and would not resurface in Prague for another 41 years. Jan Masaryk had remained in his apartment in the Chernin Palace during the crisis, nursing his cold. His American lover, Marcia Davenport, had followed him to Prague, but now Masaryk asked her to leave for her own safety. She thought he looked grey and exhausted. On the evening of the 9th of March, Masaryk took care of routine ministerial business in his apartment. His butler brought him a dinner of roast chicken, potatoes and salad. Masaryk reminded him to wake him at 8:30 the next morning. At dawn, his lifeless body was found in the palace courtyard. Masaryk had been dead for some hours. His bathroom window, directly above, was open, and his apartment was in disarray. The official verdict was suicide. The communist authorities claimed that Masaryk had become despondent over criticisms of him in the Western press. His English friend, Bruce Lockhart, supported the suicide theory, saying that Jan had come to the end of his physical and mental strength. But it wasn't clear why a depressed Masaryk did not use the loaded revolver he kept in his room, nor the bottle of sleeping tablets in his bathroom cabinet, and chose instead to climb up and push his paunchy frame through a narrow bathroom window. The doctor who certified Masaryk's death as a suicide was himself found dead a few weeks later. His death was also ruled a suicide. In 2004, a police investigation concluded that Masaryk was murdered. The distance of his body from the building indicated he did not drop but was thrown from the window. The report argued that the perpetrators were most likely Soviet agents. Masaryk's death rid Stalin of the most popular Democrat remaining in the government. And it also put Gottwald and his ministers on notice to stay in line or suffer a similar fate. The death of Jan Masaryk distressed Beneš terribly. He made a rare trip into Prague to attend the funeral, but he made no speech and sat grimly through the proceedings. A new constitution was passed through the National Assembly on the 9th of May, but Beneš refused to approve it. It was a hybrid document that kept the shop front of the old democracy, but allowed for each democratic institution to be supervised at every level by the Communist Party. Every civil rights guarantee was smothered by a blanket provision that nullified any exercise of those rights that were deemed to be a threat to the people's democratic order. Under the new constitution, a single list of candidates from the National Front, dominated by the Communist Party, was put before the people and duly elected to the National Assembly. Beneš, who was now very ill, privately complained to Gottwald, but said nothing publicly. He resigned the presidency for the second time on the 7th of June 1948. The official announcement cited health reasons for his departure. Klement Gottwald replaced him as president, fulfilling his lifelong ambition of becoming master of Prague Castle. Beneš was granted a salary and allowed to remain in his country estate. For the first time in his life, the ailing ex-president had nothing to do. After suffering several more strokes, Beneš fell into a coma and he died on the 3rd of September 1948. He was 64 years old. Tomáš Masaryk had considered falseness to be the most dangerous of human vices. "Don't lie," he had once commanded. That would be the first law of a modern code of ethics. As president, he had taken Jan Hus's slogan, "Pravda zvítězí," truth prevails, and made it the national motto. But under this new regime, with all its weird inversions, truth would become a hostage to power once more. Reality in Prague would become slippery, mutable. Masaryk and his son Jan would simply disappear from official memory, as though they had never existed. Today there is a bust of Jan Masaryk's noble, bald head in the lobby of the Chernin Palace. But a better monument to him sits over the entrance to the family villa in Vinohrady, a bronze plaque stencilled with his sardonic reworking of Hus's motto. "The truth prevails," it says, "but it's hard work." Chapter 9. Be with us. We are with you. Mistakes. The second anniversary of the Communist Party's victorious February was celebrated with a gala ball at Prague Castle. Hedda Margolius, accompanied by her husband, walked through one glittering stateroom after another, where the ancient royal treasures of Bohemia were on display. The guests, who were a mix of senior government figures and intellectuals, helped themselves to glasses of champagne and platters of food from the buffet table. 5 years had passed since Hedda had come home to Prague in her concentration camp rags. Now her husband, Rudolf Margolius, was Deputy Trade Minister. The couple had become members of the Nomenklatura, the highest and most privileged echelon of party members. But on this night, despite the fine food and wine and the opulent surroundings, Hedda felt the old fear creeping back into her heart. Since taking the post, her husband had buried himself in his work, while Hedda mournfully observed the arrests, food shortages, the public displays of compulsory joyfulness. Within a year of communist rule, 25,000 people were jailed for political reasons. The abolition of private ownership had transformed every shop in Prague into a state-owned enterprise. Items in high demand were often kept under the counter to be sold to favoured customers or bartered for other goods. When word got out that a store was about to receive new stock, workers took hours off to stand in line outside the door. Periodic rumours of a currency devaluation sent people scurrying to buy whatever goods they could find before their savings became worthless. Under these conditions, the economy seized up and refused to work. Party propaganda nonetheless assured citizens that their nation was a model in all things for the entire world. Cinema newsreels showed footage of happy workers and grateful citizens offering floral bouquets to party leaders at public forums. The steep drop in living standards was blamed on a conspiracy of spies, saboteurs, and black marketeers. Many of Prague's writers and intellectuals had become cheerleaders for the regime. The rest resigned themselves to the new system, a furtive life of fear, blood draining out of the face, trembling hands, talking in whispers, silence, apathy, sealing windows shut, suspicion of one's neighbours, signing up for the hated party membership. At the gala, Hedda was in one of the smaller salons when President Gottwald entered the room, drunk, propped up on the arm of the Speaker of the Assembly. Gottwald's health had sharply deteriorated since taking office from alcoholism, heart disease, and the symptoms of syphilis. The President lurched towards her and demanded to know why she wasn't drinking. A waiter speedily handed both of them a glass of wine, which they drank. Then Gottwald waved his empty glass around, squinted at her, and again demanded to know why she wasn't drinking. The Speaker laughed nervously and manoeuvred the President out of the room. Hedda's legs were trembling under her gown. Gottwald's likely successor was his second in command, Rudolf Slansky, ruthless party general secretary. After taking power, Slansky had crushed the remaining voices of dissent within the country, ordering the executions of more than 100 political prisoners. Slansky was a dedicated Bolshevik, but he was also Jewish, and Stalin, in his dotage, had slid into a sump of anti-Semitic paranoia. The Soviet leader wanted a purge of the Czechoslovak party, and Slansky was the perfect candidate to play the role of string puller of a vast and fictional conspiracy. Tearing down a figure as senior as Slansky would remind the Czechoslovak party that no one was beyond Stalin's reach. Soviet ideologues accordingly drafted a document, chillingly titled "On Several Mistakes of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia," which laid the blame for many of these at Slansky's feet. Moscow's evident dislike of Slansky placed an agonising burden on Gottwald. The two men were old friends and comrades in arms who had supported each other before, during, and after the war. Deeply worried, Gottwald and Slansky responded to these Soviet hints by sending an abject telegram to Moscow in September 1949, asking for advisors to assist the STB in locating the saboteurs within the party. In October, 2 colonels from Soviet state security arrived in Prague and took over the investigation. Within months, 6 government ministers were arrested imprisoned, and subsequently tortured. In July 1951, Stalin sent a message to Prague Castle insisting that Slansky be dismissed for having appointed unreliable persons and enemies to government positions. The timing of the demand, however, was supremely awkward. The party was part way through public celebrations of Slansky's 50th birthday. 2 leather-bound editions of his written works had been published, and Gottwald had presented Slansky with the nation's highest honour, the Order of Socialism. On the 6th of September 1951, Slansky was removed as Party General Secretary and demoted to Deputy Prime Minister. Knowing he was in grave danger, Slansky performed an act of self-criticism in front of his ministerial comrades. In late November, Slansky and his wife were coming home from a party when they noticed all the lights in the house were out. Inside the darkened house, he was grabbed, handcuffed, and driven away with a hood on his head. Slansky's interrogators used well-honed Soviet methods to break him. He lost all sense of time as each day passed in endless rounds of questions and beatings from a rotating shift of officers. Still, Slansky denied being part of a Trotskyite Zionist plot and insisted that there had been some terrible mistake. After one interrogation session, he locked himself in a room, ripped out the telephone cord, looped it around his neck, and attempted to hang himself from the window. Maintenance workers broke open the door just in time to save him. Forced confessions led to more arrests. On the night of the 10th of January 1952, Hedda Margolius's husband, Rudolf, failed to come home. At 1 a.m, 5 men came to the apartment and told Hedda that Rudolf had been arrested. Hedda sat in her armchair, smoking cigarettes, glaring at the STB officers as they searched each room, confiscating items they considered suspicious. The next day, she called every high official she knew to beg for help or for information. Some expressed sympathy, but could do nothing. Then they too were arrested. People who had once fawned over her now avoided her in the street. A month later, Hedda was fired from her job. For the second time in her life, Hedda was too dangerous to be seen with. A non-person. The meet queue. Late at night, as they lay in bed, Praguers became accustomed to the sound of cars pulling up in the street outside, the footsteps on the stairs, the scuffles and anguished cries from the neighbours down the hall that they had done nothing wrong. Then, in the morning, they would read in the party newspaper, Ruda Pravo, that life was getting better and better, that humanity was reaching its full potential under party rule. Even romantic love was becoming richer and more edifying. People will still fall in love, declared the culture minister, but we expect that under socialism, as the working class, they will love each other more and better than before. The credit for this new joyfulness was to be laid at the feet of Comrade Stalin. On the occasion of the great helmsman's 70th birthday, the party in Prague commissioned a gigantic monument that was to stand above the river on Letna Hill. Reaching 30 metres high, it was to be the biggest statue of the Soviet leader in the world. Stalin's shoe alone would be 2 metres long. The design competition was won by a modernist sculptor named Otakar Svets, who sketched out a heroic vision of the Soviet leader, book in hand, staring benignly across the river. Behind him, there would be a procession of Soviet and Czech heroes, a soldier, a worker with a flag, a farmer, a female partisan, The model for Svets's winning design was published in the party newspapers. Pragas instantly dubbed it Fronta na maso, the meat queue. Svets was terrified. He had entered the competition only because failure to do so would have brought him under suspicion. He had gone so far as to plagiarise another sculptor's work, hoping he would be disqualified, but he won anyway. Svets now found himself at the mercy of equally anxious government ministers and bureaucrats, fretting about this or that aspect of his design, worried it might unintentionally offend their Soviet masters. There were compositional issues. Could he make Stalin bigger and the followers smaller? Why was Stalin approaching the city from the west instead of the east? Why had he stopped at the riverbank and not continued? When ministers came to meet Svets in his studio, they would bring a penknife to lop off slivers of clay from bits of the model they didn't like. Months and then years passed in these bouts of hair-splitting, but the delay itself was dangerous and could be interpreted as a lack of ideological enthusiasm. Meanwhile, huge slabs of granite were mined and delivered to the site, ready to be sculpted into Stalin's likeness. A pedestal was constructed on Letna Hill from reinforced concrete, but Svets worried that it might not take the weight of all that granite and that the monument would collapse into the hill. The sculptor began drinking heavily and socialising with other women. His wife, Vlasta, became equally miserable and took her own life. Svets discovered her in the bathtub. On the 2nd of March 1955, 2 months before the public unveiling, Svets took a taxi to the site and asked the taxi driver what he thought of the statue. Not knowing he was in the presence of the artist, the taxi driver pointed to the thrusting arm of the partisan woman and said it looked like she was groping the crotch of the soldier behind her. "I'm telling you," he told Svets, "when they unveil it, the guy who designed it is 100% sure to get shot." Svets went back to his studio and killed himself. His body wasn't discovered for another 50 days. News of his death was covered up, and his name was not engraved on the completed monument. He too had become a non-person. The terror. The whole city was now pulled into the undertow of the Stalinist terror. In these years, nearly 250,000 Czechs and Slovaks would be convicted of political crimes, and 178 would be executed in the largest set of show trials in the Soviet bloc, scripted and orchestrated by the Soviet advisors. After 2 months of torture and constant interrogation, Rudolf Slansky's will broke, and he agreed to say and do everything asked of him. The beatings ended, and the food improved. The interrogators spent weeks helping Slansky memorise and rehearse his confession. Of the 14 men indicted in the Slansky trial, 11 were Jewish, including Hedda's husband Rudolf Margolius. The prosecutors labelled the accused as repulsive traitors, as dogs and wolves. Each defendant made elaborate admissions of guilt, claiming they had joined the Communist Party merely to subvert it from within. All of them confessed that they had been part of a complex fascist, Titoist, Zionist, bourgeois nationalist plot to destroy the people's democracies. On the 27th of November 1952, 11 of the defendants, including Slansky and Margolius, were sentenced to death. On the scaffold at Pankratz prison, Slansky thanked his executioner and muttered, "I'm getting what I deserved." He was thinking, possibly, of others he had once condemned on trumped-up charges. The method of hanging was the same used on Karl Hermann Frank. death was achieved through slow strangulation on a short drop with a cord instead of a noose. Such a sadistic process suggests a degree of gleeful hatred for the so-called traitors on the scaffold. The show trials were broadcast to a mass audience on state radio. If listeners held private doubts as to the victim's guilt, or of the sanity of the howling prosecutors, they mostly kept those reservations to themselves. Enormous pressure was brought to bear on people to act as though they truly believed everything was just as the authorities said it was. The people were being trained to manage a constant inner tension, the need to pay lip service to the prevailing ideology while concealing inner disagreement. In this way, a person might know the condemned men to be innocent, but can sincerely hate them as traitors all the same. Of the 178 people executed in the Stalinist show trials in Prague, only one was a woman. Milada Horakova was a pro-Masaryk Democrat, a socialist and a sincere Christian. After she graduated from Charles University with a law degree, she became an activist in the women's movement and the Czechoslovak Red Cross. Milada's mentor in these years was the influential senator Františka Plamenková, a Czech feminist who had formed the Committee for Women's Suffrage before the war. While attending several women's forums, Milada met and befriended another feminist pioneer, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the US president. During the Nazi occupation, Milada Horakova was arrested and tortured by the Gestapo at Terezin. At war's end, she re-entered public life as a left-of-centre anti-communist and won a seat in the National Assembly. When the communists took power in 1948, she resigned her seat. A year later, she was arrested and imprisoned again. Her husband escaped to West Germany, and she never saw him again. In the course of her trial, the prosecution presented evidence of gun caches and swastika flags, implying that she, a Gestapo victim, was a closet Nazi. Milada expected to be sentenced to some years in prison, but the government orchestrated a public campaign of letters, meetings and petitions calling for her to be given the death penalty. Her co-defenders confessed their guilt and agreed that they deserved the death penalty, but Milada refused to play the role assigned to her in the courtroom. She said she would accept the punishment the court assigned to her, but she would remain faithful to the ideals of Masaryk and Benesch. "And I want to say this," she told the courtroom, "no one in this country should be made to die for their beliefs, and no one should go to prison for them." On the 8th of June 1950, the court sentenced Milada Horakova to death. Winston Churchill, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Albert Einstein sent messages asking for clemency, but they were ignored. As she awaited her execution, Milada wrote a series of letters to her family that were never delivered. Her daughter Jana, who was 16 at the time, read hers 40 years later, after the fall of the communist regime. "My only little girl Jana, God blessed my life as a woman with you. Apart from your father's magic, amazing love, you were the greatest gift I received from fate. Don't be frightened and sad because I am not coming back anymore. Learn, my child, to look at life early as a serious matter. Life is hard. It does not pamper anybody. And for every time it strokes you, it gives you 10 blows. Become accustomed to that soon. Don't let it defeat you. Decide to fight. Have courage and clear goals, and you will win over life. Much is still unclear to your young mind. and I don't have time left to explain to you things you would still like to ask me. One day, when you grow up, you will wonder and wonder why your mother, who loved you and whose greatest gift you were, managed her life so strangely. Perhaps then you will find the right solution to this problem. Perhaps a better one than I could give you today myself. I kiss your hair, eyes and mouth. I stroke you and hold you in my arms. I really held you so little. I shall always be with you. Milada Horakova and the other condemned prisoners were led into the courtyard of Pankratz prison. Party members had been awarded special tickets to witness the hangings, and they treated the spectacle like an exciting sporting contest, littering the courtyard with cigarette butts and chocolate wrappers. As she stepped up to the scaffold, Milada was heard to say, "I am falling, falling. I lost this battle. I am falling honourably. I love this land. I love this people. Work for its prosperity. I am departing without hatred for you. I wish you. And then she died. The Engineer of Human Souls. The death of Stalin on the 5th of March 1953 was announced in a sombre black-bordered edition of the party newspaper Ruda Pravo. The editorial writers reached for every kind of overwrought superlative, as though Stalin was somehow still looking over their shoulders. President Gottwald paid tribute to the dead man as one of the two greatest geniuses in human history. Lenin was the other, and then boarded a plane to attend the funeral in Moscow. But Gottwald was not a well man either. 5 days after the funeral, he suffered a burst artery and died, and so Prague put on its mourning clothes for the second time in a week, with black veils draped across windows and flags at half-mast. Gottwald's coffin was ferried through the cold streets of Prague to scenes of performative weeping. His untimely death was hailed as the supreme act of loyalty to Stalin. Gottwald's replacement as party leader, which was variously titled General Secretary or First Secretary, was Antonin Novotny, who won the job with Moscow's backing. Square-jawed, thin-lipped, with a fine head of steel-grey hair, Novotny was sometimes flattered with the nickname Krasny Tony, Beautiful Tony. One colleague, however, described him as a frigid political hoodlum with the approximate charm of a petulant cobra. Trained as a locksmith and metalworker, Novotny signed up as a founding member of the nascent Czechoslovak Communist Party at the age of 16. When Nazi Germany invaded Prague in 1939, Novotny went underground until the Gestapo found him and sent him to Mauthausen concentration camp. After the war, Novotny returned to Czechoslovakia, climbed the ranks of the Communist Party, and in 1951 he entered the Presidium of the Central Committee, the party's supreme governing body, just as the Stalinist terror was getting underway. Novotny took a leading role in preparing the case for the judicial murder of his former comrades Slansky and Clementis. After the traitors' executions, their household possessions were passed on to senior party members. Novotny's wife, Borzhena, helped herself to the Clementis family's bed linen and tea set, which she had often admired while visiting their home in happier times. Novotny, for his part, felt no qualms sleeping between the sheets of a man whom he'd connived to have executed. Having survived a Nazi invasion, internment in a concentration camp, and the Stalinist terror, Novotny may well have concluded that perpetual horror and violence was simply the way of the world. Under Novotny's rule, Czechoslovakia became a model Soviet satellite. Moscow rewarded his loyalty by naming a mountain in Kyrgyzstan for him. But he was at a loss to know how to respond when Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, delivered a sensational secret speech in Moscow denouncing Stalin's crimes and failures. Khrushchev's speech left Novotny, the obedient Stalinist, right out on a limb. Despite his reflexive obedience to Moscow, Novotny could hardly renounce the purges and executions of the Stalinist terror because he couldn't disown his own role in them. If de-Stalinisation was simply too hard to fully address in an open, meaningful way, it could at least be implemented at a cosmetic level by getting rid of the party's grand folly, the supermassive Stalin monument that continued to menace the city from its perch on Letna Hill. It seemed prudent now to tear the thing down. Typically, Novotny went about it in a manner that might allow the party to pretend the monument never existed in the first place. So in October 1962, Prague residents were ordered to remain indoors, while the demolition crew set about razing Otakar Svetz's accursed statue to the ground. The head of the crew was ordered to demolish it, but with dignity. Demolishing the 15-metre-high, 17,000-tonne monument in a single big explosion risked sending massive chunks of granite flying into the old town, so it would have to be demolished in stages. More than 800 kilograms of dynamite were required. The result could hardly pass unnoticed. Booming explosions shook windows across the city, filling the streets with smoke and grit. It was rumoured that the first detonation had decapitated one of the observers, a party chieftain, and sent his head splashing into the Vltava River. In 1957, First Secretary Novotny assumed the mantle of President of the Republic, and he moved into Prague Castle. In 1960, he introduced a new constitution, his proudest achievement, which hailed the Czechoslovak state as the first nation in the Soviet bloc to fully achieve socialism. But it was all downhill for him thereafter. The Stalinist terror had scarred the country economically as well as psychologically. The purging of independent thought and enterprise created a managerial vacuum that was filled by unqualified apparatchiks who had nothing but their abject loyalty to recommend them for their positions. The overall effect was like putting the levers of the economy in the hands of anxiously obedient circus animals, ever watchful for cues from their masters. Bohemia, once a manufacturing powerhouse, slipped well behind its prosperous neighbours in the west. People living in the industrially poisoned borderlands could see on West German television how different life was in the capitalist world. In 1963, the leadership was presented with statistics showing that Czechoslovakia's national income had gone into reverse. Party economists responded by gingerly putting forward a set of proposals recommending decentralisation of decision-making and the introduction of price signals to make state-owned enterprises more responsive to consumer demand rather than meeting arbitrary production targets. Novotny publicly supported the reforms while working all the while to undermine them. He was struggling with the same problem all leaders in the Soviet bloc faced: the need to improve productivity and raise living standards without unleashing energies the party might not be able to control. Novotny forlornly placed his hopes in Marxist theory, which predicted that advances in technology would resuscitate economic activity and revive the communist project. Novotny was thrown further off balance when Khrushchev was removed from power in 1964 by a Politburo clique led by Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev, the new Soviet leader, was a cautious and formidable political animal who, like Stalin, was deft at pinning responsibility for policy failures on his rivals while avoiding blame for his own. The bushy-browed, jowly Brezhnev was typical of his generation of Soviet leaders who had survived Stalin's Great Terror and the Second World War, and now longed for security and stability. Brezhnev put a stop to his predecessor's mild, liberal reforms, and he tightened control over free expression. The new conservative mood in Moscow put Czechoslovakia out of sync once again with its Soviet masters. Because just as Moscow was clamping down, the boundaries of speech and creativity in Prague were starting to loosen up. The new international spirit of play and experimentation in the 1960s infected Prague like no other communist capital. Authors played a game of cat and mouse with the authorities, writing sly, absurdist parodies that were often too subtle for the dim-witted senses to pick up until the works had already found an audience on the page, the stage, or the screen. Ivan Klima's first play, titled The Castle, with a nod to Kafka, was a clever allegory of the party's insidious capacity to make its favoured artists complicit in its crimes. The Castle was picked up by Prague's Vinohrady Theatre Company and performed to full houses for weeks before party members twigged that the play was hostile to socialism and shut it down. Playwright Václav Havel was then in his late 20s. By the mid-1960s, he had established an international reputation with his plays The Garden Party and The Memorandum. Havel was fascinated by officialdom's abuse of language and its compulsive need to detach words from their meaning. The Memorandum, which was a black comedy, was set in the offices of an unspecified bureaucracy where the manager receives a directive from the authorities ordering him to implement a new officially mandated language called Ptydepe, spelt P-T-Y-D-E-P-E. This new speak, he learns, has been created to clean up the mess and uncertainty of natural speech. Commonly used words will, logically, be composed now of just 2 or 3 letters, whereas an uncommon word like wombat will contain a gigantic string of 319 letters. Unfortunately for the director, the memorandum itself is written in this terrifyingly impenetrable new language. His secretary, he discovers, is able to translate Ptydepe, but she lacks the necessary official authorization to do so. The headwinds of the 1960s were also blowing through Prague's Barrandov studios, which produced a rash of new films of startling power and originality. The films commonly used unscripted dialogue and non-professional actors to create a sense of fluidity and realism, unlike the stiff socialist realist films of the 1950s. Excited critics in the West dubbed them the Czech New Wave. Miloš Forman, who would go on to make Amadeus and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in America, made his first classic comedy, Black Peter, on the tensions and absurdities of teenage life in a small bohemian town. Jan Svankmajer created surreally beautiful short films using stop-frame animation. Jerzy Menzel's Closely Watched Trains, adapted from the book by Bohumil Hrabal, poked fun at the national myth of universal, heroic, anti-Nazi resistance. The most remarkable film from this era was Vera Kitilova's Daisies, starring 2 young, doll-like women in bikinis who resolve that since everything in this world is spoiled, they might as well be spoiled too. Accordingly, they launch themselves on a bacchanalian rampage through Prague. They gorge themselves at a vast banquet table set for party officials. They start a food fight with giant slabs of cake. They bathe in a bathtub full of milk. Vera Kitilova created an entirely new cinematic way of looking at Prague as a colour-saturated city of Art Nouveau brasseries and pop art apartments. It was a million miles away from the monochromatic, expressionistic landscapes of Der Golem. Like the surrealists of the 1930s, Vera Kitilova had the great gift of knowing how to train her camera at everyday things: a field of flowers, a box of green apples, a velvet curtain, and look at them hard enough to make them seem queer and fantastical. Inevitably, Daisies was attacked in the Czechoslovak parliament and then pulled from the cinemas, purportedly for wastage of food. The creeping influx of rock and roll was another headache for the regime. The new music, known in Prague as Big Beat, filtered into clubs and dance halls. Charles University students made furtive contact with cultural radicals from the West. In March 1965, they invited American beat poet Allen Ginsberg to Prague. Ginsberg, the long-haired prophet of sexual freedom, created a sensation as he read his poetry in small venues around the city. Each night he drank at the Viola wine bar on Narodny Street, surrounded by a pack of worshipful Czech beatniks. Prague students were so delighted with Ginsberg, they crowned him their Král Majales, the king of their May Day celebrations. The day itself was riotous. The gay, bearded hippie king was carried through the streets of Prague in an open-topped vintage car, wearing a golden crown and love beads. Ginsberg, thoroughly enjoying himself, sang Buddhist mantras, played finger cymbals, and delivered a speech honouring Franz Kafka in front of the building where The Trial had been written. Students laughingly chanted mock slogans. All slogans were pre-approved. We agree with them all. And better a stupid system than the need to think. Later that night, the king of May Day held a discussion with a room full of students. Ginsberg, who was no fan of Western capitalism, didn't much care for communist repression either. Marxism, he explained, could only mean cruel spiritual terror. The regime by now had become fed up with the hairy American interloper, and he was arrested on a spurious charge of public drunkenness. Ginsberg dropped out of sight for 2 days, then was discovered at the Viola, where 3 STB officers plied him with cheap Georgian cognac and then stole his notebook containing the names of his sexual partners in Prague. The STB brought in the humiliated young men for questioning. 2 days later, Ginsberg was assaulted while walking down Jindřiška Street after midnight. His attacker was an STB officer codenamed Lubor, who charged after him, calling him a homo. Ginsberg was expelled from the country and put on a plane to London, where the incensed poet wrote one of his most famous works, The King of May. The trip ended badly, but on the whole, it had been a wild ride for Ginsberg and his student devotees, who were inspired by his vision of radical freedom. The virus of rebellion had entered the bloodstream of Prague's youth. We want light. On the 27th of June 1967, the 4th Congress of the Czechoslovak Union of Writers convened in Prague, and almost immediately there was an uproar. Previous congresses had served as a forum for writers to declare their fealty to communism. Now, onlookers watched with astonishment as party members Ludvík Vaculík, Milan Kundera and Pavel Kohut attacked the regime and its leaders as a menace to free thought and creativity. Are they really masters of everything? Vaculík asked. What then? Do they leave in the hands of others than their own? Nothing? Then we needn't be here. The hall erupted into applause as party loyalists walked out in protest. The backlash from the regime was swift. Control of the literary magazine was taken out of the hands of the reformists. Klima and Vaculík were expelled from the party, but still, quite remarkably, no one had been arrested. On the night of the 31st of October 1967, the lights went out in a dormitory at Prague Technical University. Power outages had become a semi-regular event in the dormitory, but on this occasion, disgruntled students met in the quadrangle and decided to protest. The mass of students marched out towards Prague Castle, chanting, "We want light! We want light!" The authorities, scrambling to respond, sent a mass of police cars to meet the students at the bottom of Neredova Street. Uniformed officers chased the protesters up the hill, and then a squad of cars stormed the Strahov dormitory, assaulting the students with batons and tear gas. No mention of the demonstration appeared in the following day's edition of Ruda Pravo, but word of the violent police attack spread through the city. Students demanded an inquiry into police brutality. The protest and the police's thuggish behaviour created an expectation in the city that something had to change. The Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev visited Prague in late 1967 to conduct meetings with senior party figures. The Soviet leader was shocked at the depth of hostility to Novotny within the party. Before he left, he offered the embattled president only lukewarm support. He told him, "It's your affair," and left the Czechoslovak party to sort out its own petty squabbles. Without Moscow's firm backing, Novotny was finished. But Brezhnev had misjudged the situation. He mistook the sniping in Prague as a reaction against Novotny's obnoxious personality, when, in fact, the rift lay much deeper. The turmoil in Prague was an ideological struggle for the soul of the Communist Party. Conflict was about to shake the world. 1968. On the 5th of January 1968, the Presidium of the Central Committee issued a bland communiqué announcing that Comrade Novotny had asked to be relieved of his post as Party First Secretary to allow him to concentrate on his important symbolic work as President of the Republic. The new First Secretary was Alexander Dubček, a reformist and a Slovak. Dubček was tall and trim, with neat, slicked-back hair and a long, beak-like nose. His warm, open smile identified him as an altogether different creature from his dour predecessors. Dubček inherited his communist idealism from his father, who had taken his young family to the Soviet Union in the 1920s to help build socialism. The Dubček family had travelled all the way out to Kyrgyzstan near the Chinese border, where Dubček spent his boyhood. The family returned to Slovakia in the crisis year of 1938, and the teenaged Alexander joined a local Communist Party cell in Bratislava. In the later war years, Alexander and his brother Julius joined the Slovak partisans. Julius was killed in combat, and Alexander wounded twice in the leg. The fight against fascism in these years bound him even closer emotionally to the Communist Party and to its promise of justice and freedom for working people. After the war, Dubček got married. He took a factory job in Bratislava and was steadily promoted from factory official to regional party secretary. As a loyal apparatchik, Dubček supported the Stalinist purges, and he condemned bourgeois nationalism, a catch-all phrase used to condemn those who wanted greater autonomy for Slovakia. Recognising the gaps in his education, Dubček enrolled at Moscow Political College, where he began to hear troubling stories from former prisoners of Stalin's gulags. Dubček, who would never be deterred from his conviction in the rightness of communism's historic mission, was nonetheless shaken by these accounts. He graduated from Moscow with honours, and at home his star rose even higher. In 1960, he was elected to the Central Committee, where he formed links with reformists and fellow Slovaks alienated by the boorish Novotny, who seemed to regard Slovakia as a kind of colony within the Czech nation. In 1963, Dubček was named party chief in Bratislava, and Slovakia moved towards greater liberalisation. Novotny interpreted this as an attack on his authority, and the two men became enemies. Brezhnev's non-committal stance on the leadership gave Dubček and his allies an opening, and Novotny was pushed out. Prague's writers and intellectuals greeted Dubček's appointment to the leadership with a shrug, assuming that one party hack had been replaced by another. But within weeks, Dubček gave the go-ahead to the economic proposals that had stalled under Novotny. The pace of reform began to pick up. In late January 1968, the Writers' Union elected Dr. Eduard Goldstucker, a former political prisoner, as its new chairman. Goldstucker soon began appearing on state television, saying remarkable things, speaking candidly about the party's mistakes, and holding up before and after photos of a senior party meeting with the various non-persons airbrushed out. Circulation of the Writers' Union magazine, Literarny Listy, leapt to unprecedented figures as readers enjoyed the delicious thrill of reading previously forbidden material. Exhilarated by this new atmosphere of openness, writers and intellectuals debated what the priorities for reform ought to be. Goldstucker, in a TV discussion, told a panel of students, "The world is watching whether we shall be able to do what history has not yet known, to unite socialism with freedom." Street demonstrations rolled across Prague, demanding freedom of speech and an inquiry into the Stalinist purges of the 1950s. This gave Dubček the political latitude to push Novotny out of Prague Castle and appoint a new president, Ludvík Svoboda, a popular general who had been designated a hero of the Soviet Union for his wartime leadership. And then, with Dubček's tacit consent, the party simply stopped bothering to enforce censorship. Baffled citizens wondered how Dubček had managed to outfox the hardliners on the Presidium. It was a simple case of competence prevailing over ineptitude. One of the members of the Presidium, Zdeněk Mlynář, who was one of Dubček's closest colleagues, had set up a bureaucratic process that allowed the better educated reformers to master their complex briefs and to distill party reports into concrete policy recommendations, thereby running rings around the clueless conservatives on the Presidium who were more accustomed to acting on instructions from above. First Secretary Comrade Alexander Dubček was young, open and affable, unlike any other leader in the communist bloc. His personal charisma became a major political asset. After just 3 months in power, the first secretary was riding a wave of popularity and hope. As Dubček and his allies groped towards a more humane form of communism, they took care to reassure Moscow that the party was still very much in control of events, that the changes were purely internal, and that they need not worry about his country's loyalty to the Soviet bloc. For Dubček, there was no question of dropping the party's historic commitment to socialism, so long as they remained a one-party state, firmly within the Warsaw Pact. Dubček couldn't see why Soviet leader Brezhnev would mind their small domestic excursion into openness and freedom. Brezhnev, however, did mind, particularly when party leaders in East Berlin, Warsaw and Ukraine complained to him that the Czech virus was seeping through their borders, creating unrest among their young people. The East German leader Walter Ulbricht went so far as to clamp down on all business and personal travel to Czechoslovakia, which he feared was becoming a window to the West. Dubček nonetheless remained confident he could keep the Soviet bear at bay. Some nervous party members recalled what had happened the last time a Soviet bloc country had tried to liberalise. Hungary's experiment with multi-party democracy in the 1950s had ended in a bloody Soviet invasion. But Dubček told himself the mistake the Hungarians had made was to threaten to leave the Warsaw Pact. So long as he didn't stray from the alliance, Dubček calculated that Moscow would have to learn to live with the Czechoslovak experiment. Perhaps down the track, the Soviets might even choose to follow their example. On the 23rd of March, Dubček and senior party colleagues travelled to Dresden, ostensibly for a meeting with the Soviet bloc leaders on issues relating to economic cooperation. But Dubček had been deceived. As he sat down at the table, he was confronted by a united front of communist leaders from Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, and the USSR, who took turns to express their deep concern. Brezhnev put it starkly. "We see a danger," he said, "which has brought the entire public life of Czechoslovakia to counter-revolution." Poland's leader, Gomulka, warned Dubček that although they had no intention of interfering, there are, of course, situations when so-called domestic affairs naturally become external affairs, thus affairs of the entire socialist camp. Dubček's colleagues were taken aback. Oldrich Černík strongly defended the reforms, explaining how the new atmosphere of openness had reignited genuine popular enthusiasm for the party. The men across the table remained stone-faced. The chastened Czechoslovak leaders promised to take the criticisms on board, carefully reanalyse the situation. But on returning to Prague, Dubček chose to downplay the veiled threats put to him in Dresden. "The comrades are on our side," he reassured party members, "and want things to work out." On the 1st of April 1968, the Central Committee in Prague shocked Brezhnev by passing an action program, a radical document by Soviet standards calling for greater democratisation, for the rehabilitation of the victims of Stalinism, and for greater autonomy for Slovakia. The program set the Czechoslovak Communist Party on an historic voyage into the unknown, to find a third way between the rocks of rapacious capitalism and repressive Stalinism, an approach that Dubček called socialism with a human face. The action program proposed a 10-year transition period, but immediately the cry went up, "Why wait?" Oldrich Černík was appointed Prime Minister on the 8th of April, and the same month a new inquiry was launched into the circumstances of Jan Mazaryk's death. Author Ladislav Mlnáčko, who had initially regarded Dubček with scepticism, was completely disarmed by his reformist courage. "I didn't think he could rise this high," he said. "A man like this, as good as this." The season of radical change caught the eye and imagination of the Western media, which dubbed it the Prague Spring. Journalists and photographers were sent from all over the world to capture the excitement in the streets. Zdeněk Mlynář, the chief author of the action program, described the Prague Spring as a moment of sudden joy at the end of a long period of despair, at the end of oppression, and the feeling of a new beginning. Prague's May Day parade of 1968 was a genuinely exuberant event. Alongside the groups of workers, soldiers and schoolkids massed in Wenceslas Square were long-haired hippies marching under an oversized candy-coloured umbrella that said, "Dubček, hold out for us." A country girl dressed in traditional costume was spotted wearing an "I'm on LSD" badge. while another group of young people marched under an umbrella with the slogan, "Student Power." While Prague danced, the Kremlin shuddered. The Soviets could never shake the suspicion that the Americans and the CIA were somehow secretly guiding events in Czechoslovakia. In early May, Dubček was summoned to Moscow, where Brezhnev issued another dead-eyed warning to pull back, to change course. "The situation, I repeat, is very serious," he cautioned. "This is no longer an internal matter." Brezhnev could hardly have made himself clearer, warning that he was ready to take far-reaching steps to deal with the matter. Dubček noticed one of his colleagues, Vasil Bilak, nodding along with the Soviet leader. On his return to Prague, Dubček tried a shift in tone. He reiterated his support for the action program, but insisted that change could only come through the Communist Party. Dubček's power now rested on his public popularity, which would collapse if he were to do Moscow's bidding and abandon reform. He tried to rein in growing media criticism of the Communist Party, but to no avail. "Why are they doing this to me?" he asked his friend Mlinaj plaintively. "They would have been afraid to do this under Novotny. Don't they realise how much harm they're causing me?" Despite Brezhnev's warning, Dubček believed he had no alternative other than to press ahead. And in June, the Central Committee officially removed all media censorship. The next day, Ludvík Vaculík published a manifesto called 2000 Words, which called for the cause of democracy to be carried further outside the Communist Party. Toward the end of Vaculík's essay, a premonition of disaster fluttered through the pages. "There has been great alarm recently," he wrote, "over the possibility that foreign forces will intervene in our development. Whatever superior forces may face us, all we can do is stick to our own positions, behave decently, and initiate nothing ourselves." Such dark thoughts could never be entirely banished from the mind, even as the excitement of the Prague spring shifted into the warm haze of summer. Photos of this time show young women in checked miniskirts applying thick mascara before nightclub mirrors, teenagers kissing in dance halls, workers standing outside newspaper offices reading the day's stories, bearded beatniks reclining in jazz clubs, old women with shopping bags signing petitions in the street. News footage shows a grinning, boyish Dubček being applauded in the street. The pace of change was dizzying. "Never before or since," Ivan Klima later wrote, "have I lived with such haste or intensity." Overhanging everything was the question of whether Czechoslovakia could become a genuine multi-party democracy. There was a logic to Vaculík's argument that Dubček's reforms, unless they were reversed, must eventually lead to something like Western-style parliamentary democracy, where the Communist Party would have to risk losing power in a free election. As if in readiness for a multi-party future, civic organisations began to spring up outside the party. In May, a group calling itself the Club of Committed Non-Party Members, shortened to CAN, formed to promote human rights and political pluralism. The conductor and composer, Dr. Emil Ludwig, set up a similar organisation, the Society for Human Rights, dedicated to reviving the democratic legacy of Tomáš Masaryk. Another group, called K231, emerged to campaign on behalf of former political prisoners who had been tortured, forgotten in prisons, or sent into deadly work in Bohemia's uranium mines. K231's most remarkable activist was Dagmar Simková, who had been sent to a labour camp in the 1950s for anti-communist activities. In prison, the seemingly fearless Simková had organised hunger strikes for better conditions and set up a covert university with imprisoned academics. Released at last in 1966, Simkova threw herself into her work with K231, which took its name from the law used by the regime to imprison political opponents. As the political climate warmed throughout 1968, K231 petitioned the authorities to be given legal status. Dubček was sympathetic, and the group was accorded a temporary permission to exist and to hold meetings.
This is the end of CD 11. The book continues on CD 12. CD 12.
On the 29th of July, Dubček and his colleagues travelled to the Slovakian border town of Čierna nad Tisou to meet once again with the Soviet leadership. The Czech leader arrived by train to cheering crowds who were chanting, "We want Dubček! We want Dubček!" Dubček greeted his people with smiles and jokes. When one person shouted, "Don't let us down! Don't let the Russians get the better of you!" Dubček replied uncertainly, "Nothing to be afraid of." Brezhnev's and Dubček's teams sat down for bilateral talks in a modest railway workers' hall. The Czechoslovak delegation was divided between Dubček's supporters and a minority of hardliners, including Bilák and Alois Indra, who were angling to be part of any new dispensation that would follow a Soviet intervention. Brezhnev coolly listed his demands: an end to anti-Soviet statements in the Czechoslovak media, and the abolition of non-party political groups like KAN and K231. Dubček, sensing real trouble now, agreed to do something about the press. Brezhnev took that to mean he would reintroduce censorship. But for Dubček, it meant having a word with the authors and the editors concerned and asking them to tone it down. Ludvík Vaculík, returning to Prague from Čierna nad Tisou, remarked, "It's hanging by a thread." Dubček still believed he could prevail in the face of Brezhnev's hostility by remaining steadfastly loyal to the Soviet bloc. But the true note of caution for the Prague Spring was not struck in 1956 in Budapest, but 6 years after that, in Berlin, when the Soviets had been compelled to construct a double-layered prison wall across the city with towers and armed guards to staunch the steady outflow of people from their sector into the West. At the time, many saw the construction of the Berlin Wall as an impressive act of Soviet resolve, when in fact it was a thing born of weakness, an admission of political failure. The Soviet world was exposed as a creature with a faulty immune system, which could only be sustained by hermetically sealing itself off against the free flow of information and people. By opening Czechoslovakia to the world, Dubček had, unwittingly, pierced another hole in the Soviet bubble. Moscow would again be forced to act to protect itself. 3 days later, at a Warsaw Pact summit, the Slovak hardliner Vasil Bilák furtively handed a letter to the Ukrainian party boss Petro Shelest in the men's room. The note, which was signed by 8 members of the Czechoslovak Presidium, stated that Dubček was waging political and psychological terror against communists in Prague. The signatories warned that the gains of socialism in Czechoslovakia were under threat. They requested Soviet military intervention, quote, if circumstances should so warrant, to block the path of counter-revolution. Dubček, caught between the aspirations of his people and the demands of his Soviet benefactors, was running out of time. On the 15th of August, he received a phone call from Brezhnev, who dressed him down for failing to quash anti-Soviet press commentary. Dubček insisted that he had spoken to the people concerned and they had agreed to put a stop to all polemical articles. "But Sasha," Brezhnev groaned, "we agreed that all mass media, the press, radio, television, will be brought under the control of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. What I'm getting at here is that you're deceiving us. I'm not able to regard it as anything other than deceit." Dubček was overcome and lost for words. "Alexander Stepanovich," Brezhnev said coolly, "I'm sorry that you are getting so upset. In important matters, emotions cannot save the day." At Brezhnev's request, Dubček met with the Hungarian leader János Kadar one last time on the banks of the Danube River. Kadar, the most astute of the Warsaw Pact leaders, was sympathetic. He warned Dubček of unforeseeable consequences if he failed to do Brezhnev's bidding. As they parted, Kadar asked Dubček, "Do you really not know the kind of people you're dealing with?" Europarty. In Prague, the carnival atmosphere whirled on through the summer heat. In mid-August, a television crew rolled into town to make an episode of a popular West German music program called Europarty, with a group of international singing stars. Shirley Bassey mimed Goldfinger at a construction site, and she performed Big Spender on Narodny Street, skipping past startled shoppers. The popular Czech singer Marta Kubišová performed with her group The Golden Kids, as did the French pop artist Françoise Hardy. On the afternoon of the 20th of August, the Europarty crews set up their cameras on the Malá end of the Charles Bridge to record a song from the British group The Moody Blues. There was no dressing room, so the police turfed a family out of their nearby apartment so the embarrassed band members could get changed into their ruffled blouses. French television host Albert Reisner interviewed Les Moody Blues in English, smoothly translating their answers into French and German, and then left them to perform Nights in White Satin to a crowd of hundreds of happy young Praguers. The medieval towers seemed to complement the song's vaguely chivalric lyrics. It was a moment when Prague, for better or worse, was being welcomed into the wider world of contemporary pop culture. The Prague Spring had just hours left to run. Later that night, Yaroslav Kovaříček was walking home to his apartment in Malá Strana. Yaroslav was then a 24-year-old musicology graduate from Charles University. More recently, he'd become involved with the Society for Human Rights, in the hope that his country could one day become like Austria, a neutral democratic state outside the Soviet bloc. Yaroslav had been drinking with friends in a pub. It was past midnight when he crossed the Legion Bridge over the Vltava. Overhead, he heard planes buzzing in the moonless sky, but could see nothing. He went home to his bed and fell asleep. Several hours later, the phone jolted him awake. "We are occupied," a friend's voice told him. "The Russians are here." Yaroslav got dressed and ran downstairs, where he saw tanks clanking down the narrow street. At 1:30 a.m., 2 Soviet aircraft had landed at Prague Airport. More than 30 soldiers had disembarked and seized control of the main building and control tower. With the airport secured, a succession of Soviet AN-12 transport planes touched down on the runway, one after another in intervals of less than a minute, disgorging more Soviet paratroopers, officers and tanks. Within hours, an entire airborne division had assembled on the tarmac. ready to make its way into central Prague. In the Central Committee building, the Presidium was in late-night session when Oldrich Chernik burst into the room with the news that more than 200,000 troops from the Soviet Union and 4 Warsaw Pact countries had just surged across the border into Czechoslovakia. The stunned Presidium tried to absorb the news. Vasil Bilak, the plotter, who had known this was coming, stood up and paced nervously around the room, waiting to be called a traitor. "All right, lynch me," he shouted. "Why don't you kill me?" Dubček was devastated. "This is my own personal tragedy," he told the room tearfully. "I have always loved Russia. I have devoted my entire life to cooperating with the Soviet Union, and this is what they've done to me." His colleague, Lenage, quickly drafted a resolution condemning the invasion as a breach of international law, and it was put to a vote. 2 of the plotters on the Presidium lost their nerve and defected back to Dubček's side, and the vote was passed 7-4. The message was defiant, but Dubček wanted no bloodshed, and so the defence minister gave orders for the Czechoslovak army to remain confined to barracks and not to open fire on the invaders under any circumstances. Determined to hang on as First Secretary, Dubček retreated to his office with his allies, where he stared at the phones on his desk, still hoping someone might call and tell him that this was all some kind of monstrous misunderstanding. Watching from his window, he saw a crowd of young demonstrators gathering in front of the building, chanting his name, waving national flags. At 4 a.m, Dubček looked out and saw a black Volga sedan leading a convoy of tanks and armoured cars across the Lvarka Bridge towards the building. The crowd failed to move away in time, and the soldiers opened fire to clear a path, killing a young man. As the armoured vehicles pulled up at the entrance, Soviet paratroopers carrying automatic weapons leapt out and formed a tight cordon around the Central Committee building. Across the still dark city, telephones rang out from house to house. Taxi drivers flicked their lights on to high beam and honked their horns to rouse people from their beds. In Hradčany, US journalist Alan Levy saw a dozen tanks coming down the ramp from the Strahov Monastery into the open space of Pohorelets Street. He saw a Soviet soldier pop his head out of a turret, looking around and squinting at what appeared to be an old tourist map. They were lost. The frustrated officer produced a pistol and demanded directions to the castle from the onlookers, but nobody was willing to help, even though the castle was just around the corner. As more people woke to the crisis, they instinctively tuned into Czechoslovak radio, which continued to broadcast the statement from Dubček condemning the invasion. The realisation that the broadcaster had not yet been occupied encouraged thousands of listeners to rush through the early morning darkness to defend the radio headquarters in Vinohradska Street. Some were still wearing their pyjamas. The swelling crowd of protesters set up a defensive barricade to protect the studio building. Buses, cars and trucks were turned over and set alight. Then a tram was halted and, with the aid of its passengers, derailed and pushed into the barricade. As the protesters prepared for the inevitable arrival of Soviet tanks, broadcasters within the radio building set out an urgent appeal to the city. Be with us. We are with you. Daylight broke, and at 8:30 a.m, 6 tanks came trundling into Vinohradska Street, rolling right over the barricaded trams and crushing them beneath their tracks. A protester threw a Molotov cocktail, and a tank burst into flames. Then an ammunition truck ignited and exploded in the street, demolishing the facade of a building and tearing a hole in the road. The panicked Soviet troops retaliated by firing wildly, killing 17 protesters. Another 65 people were wounded by bullets and grenade fragments. A squad of troops stormed past the dead and dying civilians and charged into the radio building. A newsreader was mid-sentence when the studio door was flung open and a soldier barked a single command in Russian: "Out!" The Soviet troops quickly occupied the first 2 floors, but not one of them bothered to check the 3rd floor, where a working studio continued to broadcast updates and messages of resistance for another 2 hours. Czechoslovak television had also been on the air, broadcasting continuous updates until 8:30 a.m, when Soviet troops burst into the building, ordered everyone out, and then sprayed the cameras and equipment with bullets. Undaunted, the television news crews reconvened and set up an improvised broadcast studio at a nearby cinema, and then at a transmitter tower outside the city. It took hours for the invaders to locate the rogue broadcasters and to send a team of paratroopers to shut them down. As the Soviet forces advanced on the tower, the news crew turned their cameras on them, exposing the operation to millions of viewers. Despite the application of overwhelming military force, the coup was coming off the rails. Brezhnev had initiated the invasion with firm expectations that Bilak, Alois Indra and the other hardliners on the Presidium would mobilise their supporters, depose Dubček with a vote of no confidence, seize control of the media, and then quickly issue the Soviets with an official invitation to cross the border to provide fraternal assistance, giving the invasion a fig leaf of legality. But 10 hours into the invasion, none of these things had been accomplished. The hardliners had failed to dislodge Dubček and his allies from their official positions. And so the Soviets took steps to isolate the first secretary before he could rally the party into open opposition. At 9 a.m, a group of 8 soldiers armed with assault rifles burst into Dubček's office, followed by a KGB colonel with 2 plainclothes STB officers in tweed jackets and open-neck shirts. Dubček instinctively picked up the phone to make a call, but a paratrooper snatched it from him and tore the cable from the wall. Dubček and his allies were marched into a windowless room to be held at gunpoint until the Kremlin could figure out its next move. By mid-morning, tens of thousands of furious and distressed Praguers rushed into Wenceslas Square to confront the invaders. National flags fluttered defiantly from the windows as protesters swarmed around the tanks like angry hornets. People climbed onto the skirts of the tanks and harangued the confused troops, telling them to disobey their commanders and go home. Several trees lining the square were set alight. People tore off the burning branches and tried to flog the tanks with them. Some brazenly chalked swastikas on the back of the armoured vehicles. Old women banged on pots and pans from their balconies. Protesters old enough to recall the presence of Hitler's tanks in the square nearly 30 years earlier felt a harrowing sense of déjà vu. The Soviet soldiers were dumbfounded, angry and frightened. Some sat on their tanks, legs outstretched, arms folded, like petulant children. Most were conscripts from Central Asia or Ukraine, unsure of where they were. They'd been told their mission was to give fraternal assistance against Western counter-revolutionaries, and they were assured that they would be welcomed in Prague as liberators. Instead, they were surrounded by howling, jeering locals pounding on their tanks, and they began to panic. A round of bullets was shot into the air, and then the tanks swivelled their guns towards the protesters, who were massed in front of the National Museum at the top of the square. Yaroslav Kovaříček was standing near the statue of St. Wenceslas as the gunfire strafed the crowd. A protester next to him caught a bullet and fell to the ground, but it was too dangerous to stop and help. Amid the stampede of terrified citizens, Yaroslav bolted to the top of the square into Vinohradska Street, hoping to find shelter with his friends at the radio building. But he was halted by the barricades of flaming buses. In confusion, he turned into a side street and was stopped short by a column of Soviet tanks. A Russian tank commander caught sight of Yaroslav and gestured with his hand to come forward. Yaroslav was amazed. "This man is my enemy," he thought. "I should want to kill him. I must not talk to him." But there was something oddly compelling about the gesture, and so, against his better judgment, Yaroslav walked towards the Russian officer. To his astonishment, the officer came to him and embraced him. There were tears in his eyes. "It was Brezhnev," he said. "It was Brezhnev who ordered us to do this. I am a soldier. I see what we have done here, and I am so sorry." Yaroslav, sleepless and overwhelmed by the morning's events, wept too. Speaking Russian, Yaroslav asked him what he was doing here. The officer explained that he'd only just completed a degree at a university in Leningrad when the army had called him into national service. "For the last 3 months we've been in training," he said, miserably, "and I haven't seen my family. My wife's had a baby boy, and I don't know when I'll get to meet him. They'll keep us in isolation when we get back, so we won't talk about what we've seen here. They always do that." Yaroslav, who was scheduled to begin national service himself, couldn't help but sympathise. "I realised," he said later, "he was in a much worse situation than me, because at least I was free. So I really felt sorry for him. He and I were both ordinary people. We were really crying. It was all so tragic." By mid-afternoon, the Soviet plan was in tatters. International television coverage brought unforgettable images to a scandalised world. Footage of tank attacks on unarmed civilians exposed the cover story of fraternal assistance from the USSR as a sham. The sight of swastikas chalked onto the occupiers' tanks made the parallels to 1939 all too obvious. To Brezhnev's disgust, the local hardliners had been revealed as hopeless bunglers. With the existing party leadership still in place, Brezhnev reluctantly concluded he would have to strike a deal. A KGB colonel was sent to fetch Alexander Dubček and his allies, who were still under house arrest in the Central Committee building. They were brought out at gunpoint and taken in an armoured vehicle to Rzynia Airport. Inside the terminal, Dubček was told to sit and wait, as several more hours passed. He had the dawning impression that his captors didn't know what to do with him, an indication of uncertainty at the top. Then, at 9 p.m, the captive men were led across the airfield and into the belly of a Soviet Tupolev transport plane. They were flown first to an airstrip in Poland and then to another in Ukraine, where they were met by KGB agents who drove them to some nearby mountain chalets. After a few hours' sleep, Dubček was, absurdly, blindfolded with dark glasses and then driven to a Ukrainian regional party building. Dark glasses were removed and he was handed a phone. On the other end of the line was Nikolai Podgorny from the Soviet Politburo. "We have to talk," he said. Dubček was coming back to Moscow, this time as a prisoner. The United States and other NATO powers were united in their condemnation of the invasion, but showed no inclination to risk nuclear conflict by intervening militarily. The communist world, however, was badly split. Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam declared his support. Cuba, which had repelled a US military invasion of their island 7 years earlier, was torn and said nothing. The most intensely totalitarian states, China and Romania, denounced Moscow's action, as did the Italian Communist Party. Albania chose to walk out of the Warsaw Pact in protest and to align itself with Maoist China instead. In Britain, news of the invasion was met with outrage in some quarters and indifference in others. On the night following the invasion, the Russian State Symphony Orchestra appeared at London's Albert Hall. As the musicians took their seats to perform a Dvorak concerto, of all things, the musicians were heckled from the stalls with cries of, "Shame on you!" Other members of the audience, unhappy with the disruption, shouted back at the hecklers, "We want to hear the music." The Hedgehog and the Elephant. With Dubček and the reformers out of the country, the protesters in Prague continued their self-organised campaign of civil disobedience, which disoriented and demoralised the invaders. There was something magnificent about the people of Prague that week, and they knew it. The belief that they had somehow thwarted the mighty Soviet army with their bare hands bound them all together. They taunted the Russians with slogans posted all over the city. "An elephant cannot swallow a hedgehog," and "With brothers like you, we beg Mother Russia to practice contraception." Protesters rotated street signs to point the wrong way, baffling the foreign troops. Groups of Praguers passed from tank to tank, looking for soldiers willing to talk, peppering them with unwelcome questions. "Why are you here? What would you do if your home was invaded by foreign soldiers?" People queued in the street to sign petitions demanding the return of Dubček. Dissident radio stations popped up from improvised locations on different frequencies. In response, soldiers were ordered to confiscate any transistor radios they saw being used in the streets. Praguers then amused themselves by walking around with bricks of coal pressed to their ears, and were delighted when the soldiers confiscated those too. Many people, however, lost heart. Unable to see a future for themselves, they packed their suitcases and drove to the Austrian or West German border to make new lives in Western Europe or elsewhere. The border guards waved them through. Eduard Goldstucker took up an academic position in Britain. Ottokar Schick, the party economist, made his way to Switzerland. Joseph Skvoretzky and his wife Zdena went to Canada, where they set up a publishing house for Czech authors. Dagmar Simkova, the co-founder of the political prisoner support organisation K231, also chose to leave rather than risk a return to prison. This remarkable woman emigrated to Perth, Western Australia, where she completed 2 university degrees and found work as an artist, nurse, and trained as a movie stunt woman. Those who happened to be in the West at the time of the invasion faced an agonising choice: to build a new life as an exile, away from family and friends, or return to an uncertain future. Ivan Klima, who was travelling through Britain in the United States, was offered work in America, but couldn't bear the thought of being alienated from the language and landscape of his literature. He came back to Prague with his family, expecting he would never be allowed to leave again. As the protests in Prague intensified, the Soviet leadership became increasingly desperate to arrive at a solution to the crisis it had initiated. Above all, they needed a compliant government in Prague. On the 23rd of August, the Soviet ambassador Stepan Chervenenko came to the castle to ask President Svoboda to lead a workers' and peasants' revolutionary government. But President Svoboda refused. 95% of the population are behind Dubček and Černík, he warned. If they are not released, a great deal of blood will be shed. With that, the Soviet ambassador stormed out. The president was then asked to appoint a new government led by Indra and Bilak, but he declared, if I were to do anything of the sort, the nation would drive me out of this castle like a mangy dog. Instead, Svoboda proposed to lead a delegation to Russia to find an honourable and dignified solution to the crisis. The next morning, he flew to Moscow, accompanied by two of the key plotters, Bilak and Indra, as well as one of the leading reformers, a bespectacled Slovak named Gustav Husak. Moscow Protocol. Dubček and his colleagues had been dragged to Moscow like common criminals, still wearing the same dirty clothes they'd been wearing for 3 days. But when President Svoboda arrived a day later, he was received at the airport with full honours due to a visiting head of state. Brezhnev spoke to Svoboda alone, asking him what he had to propose, but the president waffled. He said he would agree to Dubček being dropped from the leadership, but had no suggestions for a replacement. The old general was past his prime. At 11 p.m, Dubček was brought into the Kremlin to meet with Brezhnev and other Soviet Politburo members, but nothing was resolved. Dubček, who was exhausted and unwell, was taken to a guest house nearby where he slept for most of the following day. When his friend Zdeněk Lenage arrived in Moscow, he insisted on seeing him at once. Lenage found Dubček lying on a bed, partially sedated, and stripped to the waist in the August heat. There was a small bandage on his forehead, covering a wound incurred from having slipped in the bathroom. Dubček told Lenage he was in an impossible position, caught between the demands of the Kremlin and the expectations of his people, cut off from news at home and undermined by some of his own people, like the treacherous Bilak, who was passing on information to the Soviets. Dubček was able to join the negotiations only intermittently. Lenage thought he was in a state of nervous collapse. In Dubček's absence, the Czechoslovak leadership fell into infighting. President Svoboda lost patience with the reformists, theatrically trying to shift the blame for the invasion on them. "There you go, talking again," he shouted. "You've already talked and talked till your country's occupied, so act accordingly and do something." Brezhnev made his position to the Czechoslovaks brutally clear. In such a crisis, he said he recognised no national borders, only the borders of socialism. "Your country lies on territory where the Soviet soldier trod in the Second World War," he told them. "We bought that territory at the cost of enormous sacrifices, and we shall never leave it." He warned that if they didn't accept Moscow's proposals, the inevitable result would be mass bloodshed. As they wrangled, Brezhnev and his colleagues studied the Czechoslovak delegation closely, trying to identify a viable future partner among them. They had already written off Bilak and Indra as incompetent clowns, but the cool professionalism of the Slovak leader Gustav Husak impressed them. Husak, whom Dubček had once regarded as an ally, was now describing himself to both parties as someone with a sense of reality. Acting as a helpful intermediary between the Soviets and his own group of reformists, Husak pressured Dubček and his men to sign off on the Soviet demands. In the negotiations, Brezhnev was able to exploit Dubček's great weakness: his lifelong loyalty to his communist ideals. Deeply riven by his duty to defend his country and his commitment to communist solidarity, Dubček simply fell apart. He agonised for 3 days, and then he consented to sign Brezhnev's ultimatum known as the Moscow Protocol, which renounced his own action program and gave formal consent to the occupation of their country. In return, Dubček would be permitted to remain in the job as First Secretary. With that, he and his colleagues were allowed to go home. Only one Czech Presidium member, Dr. František Kriegel, refused to sign. "Send me to Siberia," he said, "or shoot me dead." Dubček flew back to Prague in the early hours of the 27th of August, wondering what on earth he would tell his people. The Soviets had agreed that the final text of the Moscow Protocol was too provocative to be made public. So Dubček struggled with how he would avoid revealing the full truth of it without actually lying. At 5:50 p.m, he delivered a radio address to the nation. In a strained and halting voice, Dubček said the first thing that was needed was the normalisation of the situation as soon as possible. Yes, he said, the invading armies would be gradually withdrawn, but there would be a corresponding need for restraint to avoid prolonging the abnormal situation. As a result, the party would have to introduce some temporary exceptional measures, he said, restricting freedom of expression. Above all, he urged his people, don't make trouble. We beg you, dear fellow citizens, to help us prevent any anti-socialist provocations by some elements which are interested in worsening the situation, which is, in any case, very tense indeed. In this period, we need order. We need deliberate discipline on the part of all our citizens. Dubček's voice cracked and fell silent for long, agonising moments as he fought to compose himself. A staff member brought him a glass of water. The gentle tap of the glass on the table brought Dubček back to his senses, and after another moment, he drew breath and resumed his speech, with tears running down his face. Just a week ago, he thought he was the bringer of dignity and freedom. Instead, he'd become yet another Czechoslovak leader who had surrendered his country's future. In the long term, Moscow paid a high price for crushing the Prague Spring. The invasion destroyed the Red Army's prestige in Prague. It crippled the USSR's influence in the communist parties of Western Europe and discredited its remaining apologists elsewhere. Socialism with a human face in a one-party state was exposed as a sham. No one could now plausibly pretend that Stalinism had been a tragic aberration. For Ivan Klima, who had in his youth subscribed to the ideals of the party, the communist movement could only be seen as a criminal conspiracy against democracy. To this day, the Warsaw Pact remains the sole military alliance in history to only ever attack one of its own members. The invasion, the second of its kind in 3 decades, inflicted another generation of Praguers with a deep spiritual wound. The unarmed teenagers who pounded their fists helplessly on the tanks had witnessed the same terrible spectacle their parents had in 1939, the victory of raw power and violence over democratic values. A week after the invasion, Yaroslav Kovaříček went to pick up the new edition of the Society for Human Rights' newsletter from the printer. But the elderly man at the machines told him He shouldn't bother. If I was young like you, I would get out, he said. There's no future here. The same day, Yaroslav heard the radio replaying Dubček's choking speech, calling for normalisation. It's lost, he concluded. I might as well leave. Yaroslav said goodbye to his parents. He flew out of Prague and eventually migrated to Australia. He quickly mastered English and in time became a radio presenter for the ABC, Australia's national public broadcaster. I discovered his late-night music program, Acoustica Nova, while studying at university. I remembered Yaroslav while planning to write this book and discovered he was living on the New South Wales coast, 4 hours north of Sydney. In June 2018, I drove there with my wife Kim to spend an afternoon with him. After lunch, we sat down to record his story at the kitchen table. In Australia, Yaroslav had come to embrace Buddhist thought and to admire Aboriginal culture. He had developed an aversion to left-wing political correctness, which seemed to him another ideological imposition on free speech. From the far side of the world, he kept an eye on his lost homeland as the dreary years of normalisation rolled on. Both Yaroslav's parents died while he was away. He was unable to attend their funerals. Then came 1989, the year of miracles. Yaroslav was watching the Velvet Revolution unfold on television when he received a call from the office of Australia's most popular TV news broadcaster, Jana Wendt. Jana's family were Czech, and Yaroslav knew her father well. Now she was proposing to fly with Yaroslav to Prague to make a prime-time TV documentary telling the story of his emotional journey home to his lost city. And so, after an absence of 2 decades, Yaroslav returned to Prague in January 1990. It was very strange, he said. I used to have refugee dreams where I was back, but I couldn't get out. And suddenly, I'm crossing the river on the Charles Bridge with Jana and her camera crew, and I think I'll wake up at any moment. I had very strong emotions. Once the documentary was completed, Yaroslav had some free time to enjoy dinner with old friends. Afterwards, he wandered into Wenceslas Square to enjoy a Prague sausage and some proper Bohemian Pilsner. It was close to midnight, he told me. I went to a kiosk and ordered a beer, and I saw a group of young people with a young man sitting on a box playing guitar, and they were all singing. Yaroslav noticed the guitarist was Russian, and I thought, that's how it should be. Young Czech people, young Russian boy, singing together, enjoying it. It's just those politicians that keep pulling us apart. Feeling mellowed by the music and the goodwill, Yaroslav approached the young Russian guitarist and bought him a beer. He asked him where he had come from. Leningrad, the guitarist replied. And where have you come from? I have just come from Australia, Yaroslav answered. I had to escape in 1968, but I'm sure you don't know anything about that. You mean the invasion? Said the guitarist. How do you know about that? Yaroslav asked. I was born that year in Leningrad, the singer said. My father was sent here. He was the commander of a tank. We didn't see him for years afterwards. And when he came back, he was telling me all about what happened here, and he felt so ashamed. Yaroslav looks at our astonished faces across his kitchen table. Now, I can't prove it, he says, but I think there was a very good chance that this boy was the son of that tank commander. Chapter 10. The Second Culture. The Prague Autumn. Several days after Dubček's radio address, Paul Wilson made his way back to Prague. It was close to midnight when his train arrived at the main railway station. In the park outside, he saw a row of Soviet tanks waiting to board military trains. He walked around the corner into Wenceslas Square, but it was empty and quiet. No one had told him a curfew was in place. Paul found a working public phone and called friend after friend, but no one was home. Eventually, someone picked up and said, "We're all here at my place. Come on over." Paul slipped through the back streets to an apartment on the old town square where his circle of friends had gathered. They'd been handing out protest sheets. They'd missed the curfew and were holed up there for the night. There was no despair among this group. Not yet. They still expected something would be salvaged from the wreckage of the Prague Spring. After having come so far forward, how could they go back? Paul Wilson was a Canadian literature graduate, and he'd been living in Czechoslovakia for just over a year. Paul had known almost nothing about the country until he attended a Czech New Wave film festival in London. Paul was enchanted and mystified by the sophisticated artlessness of these films, the sly humour, the way ordinary situations could be made sinister and chilling. Soon afterwards, he had met a couple of Czech engineers in a London pub, and they started talking about communism. Paul had tried to argue that there was no reason, theoretically, why communism shouldn't work, but the Czechs laughed and insisted there was no way, practically, that it could. "Why don't you come over and see for yourself?" they suggested. Paul arrived in the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic in the summer of 1967, just as the demand for reform was starting to pick up. When his bus rolled into Prague, the capital looked run down and grimy. The slow restoration of the old Baroque buildings was failing to keep pace with the decay. Still, he could see something of Prague's fabled beauty shining through the scaffolding. Paul taught English in Brno and then in Prague. Within a year, he learnt to speak passable Czech. He established friendships within Prague's flourishing counterculture, and he felt the surge of hope and excitement of the Prague Spring. Giddy optimism overpowered the sense of threat. Paul thought that the Russians couldn't possibly do anything as drastic as invading the country, and he felt confident enough to leave town in August 1968 for a summer vacation in Yugoslavia with friends from Canada. Days later, as they watched the televised footage of tanks in Wenceslas Square, his friends advised him not to bother going back. But Paul didn't want to run out on his new gang of friends in Prague, and he was curious to find out what would happen next. Alexander Dubček's tearful speech, pleading for the normalisation of the situation, had been followed by a winding down of the campaign of civil disobedience. There was a belief that the people had made their point, that their protests had stung the Soviet giant and forced it to come to terms with their demands for greater freedom and dignity. The protest movement took Dubček at his word, that the reintroduction of censorship was an unfortunate but temporary measure to avoid bloodshed, a pause to give the reformists time to regain their bearings and move forward again later. The Soviets, however, shrewdly used the hiatus to demobilise the protest movement and then demoralise it by making Dubček and the reformers renege on their promises. Free speech was not curtailed with a sudden blow, but by a slow, ever-tightening constriction until it could no longer draw breath. Paul Wilson observed the shifting official language with each passing month. First, he noticed the word invasion was banned, replaced with intervention. Then that too was replaced with the timely arrival of the fraternal armies. All talk in the media of Dubček's January action program abruptly ceased. Independent human rights organisations such as CAN and K231 were forced to disband. The directors of the state radio and television services were removed from their posts and replaced with more compliant figures. The various bureaus of state censorship were not reinstated, which at first seemed like a concession, but a more subtle and insidious constraint was put in place. Writers, journalists and editors were now expected to monitor each other's work and practice preemptive self-censorship. This had a chilling effect on once lively newsrooms and sowed fear and distrust between former friends and colleagues. Many writers were prohibited from publishing altogether. Banners and posters with the depressing slogan, "With the Soviet Union forever," reappeared in public squares and at train stations, this time with "and never otherwise" added for extra emphasis. Leonid Brezhnev used the crisis in Czechoslovakia to assert a new principle of Soviet power that became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, whereby the USSR reserved the right to intervene militarily in the near abroad, countries within the Soviet sphere of influence, to maintain Communist Party control. Once the satellite nation had seen the light of Soviet communism, it would not be allowed to unsee it. Brezhnev pressed for a treaty to give Soviet tanks and troops temporary permission to be stationed on Czechoslovak soil. The National Assembly, which had rallied to Dubček so strongly in the days following the invasion, approved the Treaty of Occupation by a vote of 280 votes to 4. There was nothing temporary about the agreement. Soviet forces would remain in the country for another 22 years. And yet, even as their democratic freedoms shrivelled before their eyes, there was still plenty of fight in Prague and elsewhere in the country. Students burnt copies of Pravda in front of the Soviet embassy. 8,000 protesters showed up to heckle the Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister at the National Theatre. In October 1968, anti-Soviet protests sprang up around the nation on the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. State police retaliated with tear gas and truncheons. Dubček, who was now a cowed, tragic figure, issued a statement scolding the protesters, accusing them of damaging the process of normalisation and the innermost interests of the country. The next day, the new Deputy Prime Minister, Gustav Husak, announced a ban on all demonstrations. By the end of 1968, the message had sunk in. The people had been abandoned by their leaders. These dispiriting developments had done little to faze the author Milan Kundera, who even now believed the Czechs could forge a new path between Soviet communism and Western capitalism. In his essay titled The Czech Destiny, which was published in the December 1968 edition of Listy magazine, Milan Kundera argued that this was not the time to go weak at the knees. Yes, he admitted, the backlash against socialism with a human face was harsher than expected, but this was no catastrophe. I would even venture to say, he wrote, that the significance of the Czechoslovak autumn may even surpass the significance of the Czechoslovak spring. Kundera made the case for the historic mission of his country as a small nation wedged between great powers, which had often been forced to draw on its creativity to avoid being utterly subsumed by its neighbours. It was hardly surprising, therefore, that the Czechs had managed to discover a goldmine of democratic possibilities hidden under the bedrock of Soviet communism. Just as Jan Hus had once revolutionised Catholic Europe Kundera said, today's Czechs would continue to turn socialism on its head and give it new meaning. A nation thus endowed, he concluded optimistically, has every right to approach the uncertainties of the coming year with complete confidence. But Kundera's essay credited too much originality to the concept of Dubček's socialism with a human face. Socialist policies such as universal healthcare, state ownership of key utilities, and welfare payments to the unemployed had already been implemented in modern European nations like Sweden and Britain without the need for a one-party state. It was a point picked up by Václav Havel, who wrote a stinging rebuttal in another literary monthly, Tvar, which put a question mark on Kundera's title, The Czech Destiny? The Prague Spring, Havel said, was not an inspired act of political creativity, but the work of a society simply trying to remove an abnormality from its system. Freedom of speech was, he said, something self-evident in most of the civilised world, and to claim that there was anything special about the attempt to introduce it to Czechoslovakia was a pompous illusion. Havel suspected that reform communists like Kundera were fooling themselves with all this grandiose talk of national destiny. To him, it looked like they were constructing an alibi so they could shrug off their own culpability as former apologists for the party's crimes and blame it all on history instead. Prague's literary community was shocked by Havel's trenchant attack on Kundera, who had been a friend and a mentor to him. The breach between these men, the two most influential Czech writers of their time, would never quite be healed. But Havel's analysis was to prove the more clear-headed. Eventually, Kundera would resign his hopes for the Prague autumn and choose a life of exile in France, while Václav Havel followed a different star. Outside and below. Václav Havel was born in 1936 into a family of wealthy property developers and politicians. His grandfather had constructed the glamorous Art Nouveau Lucerne Palace shopping complex on Wenceslas Square, while his father and uncle built the Barrandov film studios in the city's southwest. At home, little Václav received all the care and comfort of a princeling, but his privileged status and chubby figure made him an object of derision in the schoolyard, where he was ridiculed as a fat little piglet. No matter how high or low Havel rose or sank, he would never lose this sense of exclusion, of being an outsider in the world. This view, he once said, was the key to his plays. It is a view from below, he wrote, a view from the outside, a view that has grown out of the experience of absurdity. After 1948, the Havel family's wealth and property were confiscated by the state. Václav's bourgeois background disqualified him from higher education, and he left school at 15. He wrote his first plays while fulfilling his compulsory 2 years of military service to escape the drudgery and boredom. On his release from the army, Havel took a job as a stagehand at Prague's ABC Theatre, where he felt happy and at home. Prague's theatres would form a natural refuge for him for the rest of his life. In the mid-1950s, Havel found a circle of like-minded friends at the Café Slavia, the elegant Art Deco coffee house opposite the National Theatre. It was there that he met and fell in love with Olga Shpligalova, who became his wife. Despite their different backgrounds, the marriage was close, held together by shared hardship and their complementary characters. While Václav was compulsively polite, Olga was unnervingly plain-spoken. Václav had been born into luxury, whereas Olga was marked by her proletarian origins, 4 fingers from her left hand had been severed in an industrial accident. Although Havel would conduct several serious extramarital affairs, he thought of Olga and himself as faithful, lifelong fellow travellers. His infidelities and years in prison would strain the partnership, but not break it. Havel began to write sketches and black comedies for the experimental Theatre on the Balustrade. His first significant full-length plays, The Garden Party and The Memorandum, mocked the contorted language of bureaucracy. The result was a symbiosis of Kafkaesque weirdness and Hashekian buffoonery that left audiences rocking with laughter. Havel's plays were translated and performed in Germany, Austria, Poland, France and Britain. During the Prague Spring, he was permitted to travel to the United States for the opening night of The Memorandum at New York's Public Theatre. But his enjoyment of success would always be tempered by his absurdist worldview. Havel could never quite shake the suspicion that it was all an illusion, that at some point an authority figure would walk into the room and tell him to go home or order him back to his prison cell. Havel, surprisingly, was not particularly active during the Prague Spring. Never a party member, he wasn't interested in redeeming the communist project, and he held out little hope for socialism with a human face. He did, however, acknowledge Dubček's decency and humanity. In July 1968, a month before the invasion, Havel was invited to an official writer's reception. To overcome his shyness, he downed a glass of cognac, which emboldened him to bowl up to Dubček and advise him at length on how he should deal with the Soviets and handle the opposition within his party. The next morning, he was embarrassed by his behaviour and impressed by Dubček's forbearance and his willingness to listen to advice from a half-drunk playwright. Havel and Olga were out of town, staying with a friend in Liberec, when the Soviet tanks crossed the border. In Liberec's town square, Havel saw tanks smashing down an arcade, burying people in the rubble, and his diffidence evaporated at once. Havel joined the local resistance, broadcasting messages on TV and radio from the local station, calling for the world to help the people of Czechoslovakia. As the pall of normalisation settled in, Havel became exasperated by the reform communists still trapped in their ideological cages. He thought Dubček had acted like a fool in Moscow, folding so completely to Brezhnev. Havel believed a whole range of political options had been open to Dubček, but he'd failed to grasp them, largely because he'd gone to Moscow not as the leader of a sovereign nation, but as a guilty servant of communism. Havel's impatience may go some way to explain the sharp tone of his reply to Milan Kundera's upbeat essay in the pages of Listy. But his anger might also be partly explained by the charged atmosphere in Prague in January 1969 was caused by the death of a student in Wenceslas Square. Torch number 1. The dawning realisation that the revolutionary moment had passed, that the Prague Spring was finished, was unbearable to those young people who had hoped to live their lives in greater freedom and dignity than their parents' generation. The slow winding down of expectations was particularly intolerable to an idealistic 20-year-old economics student at Charles University named Jan Palach. In his student ID photo, Palach's boyish face looks out at the world with a dark-eyed, soulful expression. Dubček's reforms had sparked his youthful idealism, and so when the Soviets invaded, he joined the protest marches and painted anti-occupation slogans in the street. But as the months passed and the mood of resignation set in, Jan Palach cast about desperately for ideas to galvanise the public's attention and revitalise the resistance. In his despair, he conceived of a radical gesture, an act that could neither be ignored nor forgotten. On the morning of the 16th of January 1969, Jan Palach sat down at his desk and wrote out copies of his final letter. He sent one to a close friend, another to the student leadership, a third to the Czechoslovak Writers' Union, and the original he put in his briefcase. In his letters, he identified himself as the head of a group of dissidents willing to take radical action to stir the sleeping conscience of the nation. He wrote that his group had drawn lots, that he, Jan Palach, had earned the right to become torch number one. But there was no group. It was just him. After posting the letters, he took 2 white plastic buckets to a petrol station on Aplotilova Street and filled them with gasoline. At 2:30 p.m, he carried the brimming buckets and his briefcase to the foot of the National Museum in Wenceslas Square. It was still strewn with rubble from the Soviet tank attack. Standing next to the museum's fountain, he tipped the fuel on his head, drenching himself and his clothes. And then, with his trembling hands, he lit a match. The flaming man leapt over the railing and ran towards the statue of St. Wenceslas, narrowly avoiding a passing tram. Then he tripped and fell to the ground. Horrified onlookers ran to him and smothered the flames with their coats as best they could. Jan Palach was still alive. Lying on the stones, trembling, smouldering, he begged the onlookers to open the briefcase he'd left near the stairs and to read the letter within. An ambulance rushed him to Vinohrady Hospital. Still conscious, he gasped to the medical staff that he wasn't a suicide case, that he had set himself on fire as a protest. "Please tell everyone why I did it," he repeated. "Please tell everyone." The doctors at the burns ward kept the police outside the door, while Palach's mother and brother stood at his bedside. Speaking as best he could, he repeated that he was part of a group, that he had not acted alone. After lingering for 3 days, he died in hospital on the 19th of January. His death led the TV news that night. Jan Palach died quietly, the newsreader announced with tears in her eyes. His body could not stand the strain of his burns. Palach's funeral procession, on the 25th of January 1969, had the scale and solemnity of a state funeral. Hundreds of thousands of people stood in freezing rain in deep silence as the coffin was ferried through the streets. No one had seen such a display of public mourning since the death of Jan Masaryk. A long train of mourners filed past his coffin, faces contorted with grief. Older women sobbed helplessly. Men wiped away tears with their fists, their faces filled with uncomprehending loss. Paul Wilson, who was in the crowd, felt a terrible sense of finality, a feeling that it was the end of hope. The world media assumed that Palach had modelled his suicide on the Buddhist monks of South Vietnam who had self-immolated in protest against the Saigon government. But Czechs naturally saw a closer link to the burning of Jan Hus. Jan Palach's prediction that others were ready to burn became a self-fulfilling prophecy as other young men chose to self-immolate in protest. Jan Zajíc on the 25th of February, Evgen Plotchek on the 4th of April, and Michael Luchik on the 11th of April. Media coverage of their deaths was suppressed by the regime. In Wenceslas Square, the site of Jan Palach's burning was transformed into an improvised shrine with candles and photo portraits of the young man. The site became a recurrent sore point for the authorities as people gathered there each year on the 16th of January to commemorate his sacrifice. The act of remembrance, the struggle against forgetting, had become as important as Jan's deed of protest. The Human Torch of Wenceslas Square succeeded in collapsing the long, drawn-out dissolution of their freedoms into a piercingly singular point in time and space. Each year, the people of Prague remember Jan Palach, not on the anniversary of his death, but on the date of his self-immolation. It's the flame, more than the death, that burns in the imagination. The Pain Gate. It's November 2011. My wife Kim has prepared a special family dinner. It's a Vietnamese dish that has to be cooked at the table. She places the ingredients in a large ceramic bowl, which sits atop a saucer with a little puddle of methylated spirits. Kim lights a match and carefully extends it towards the saucer. Our 12-year-old son, Joe, is sitting next to me. Our daughter, Emma, is 8. She's a bit spooked by the flame and she's standing well away from the table. Kim lights the fuel. A thin blue flame encircles the bowl and the ingredients begin to sizzle. The food is cooked and eaten and everyone's still hungry. Kim offers to cook some more. The flame in the dish has almost expired, so she decants a tiny amount of spirits into the plastic cap and gently tips it into the saucer. A fireball erupts across the table and my shirt and arms are on fire. I look down and see the flames rippling across it. I tear off the burning shirt and run to the bathroom. Standing under the shower, I call out in a panic, "Is everyone all right? Are the kids all right?" In the distance, I hear Kim cry out that everyone's okay and that she's trying to put out the flames. And with that, something quietens in my head. I feel the pain of the burns, but it doesn't seem to bother me as much. Confusion is replaced by a profound sense of clarity and curiosity. I open my eyes to study my wounds. The burns extend all the way up my right arm and across the fingers of both hands. The skin is blackened and ruined. In hospital, it's explained to me that hot and cold fuel are chemically different and that adding cold fuel to the hot burning spirits in the saucer had caused it to spatter and ignite mid-air, and that was how I'd caught fire. A week later, I go in for skin graft surgery. Afterwards, the new skin on my hands and arm doesn't hurt, but the flayed area on my thigh, the donor site for the skin grafts, is searingly painful. The nurses give me a mix of opioids that dim the pain, but don't quite extinguish it. Kim comes to see me one afternoon, and in the course of the hour, my painkillers start to fail, and I have to stop talking to concentrate on managing the throbbing in my leg. And this is different from the pain that I'd felt after the fire, which I'd been able to observe from a distance. This pain is closer now, and it hurts much more. It troubles me more. Kim takes my hand and closes her eyes, slowly synchronizing my breathing with hers. It seems as though she's drawing the pain out of me, like a poison. I fall into a deep sleep. When I wake up 2 hours later, she's gone, and I feel fine. Medical understanding of pain has advanced dramatically in recent decades. It was once thought that pain was a straightforward sensory experience, like hearing or vision. Pain, it was thought, operated like an emergency signal passing through a telephone line from the stimulus point up to the brain. The bigger the stimulus, the louder the bell in the brain rings. The first inkling that the experience of pain might be bound up in perception came from a study by an American doctor, Henry Beecher, who treated injured soldiers during the Second World War, and was surprised when so many badly wounded men reported having next to no pain at all. Beecher considered the context of their pain. The men were in bad shape, but they knew they had survived combat and that they were receiving the best of care, and they would return home to their loved ones as honoured veterans. For most of them, Beecher realised, the meaning of the pain was positive, and that meaning somehow diminished its intensity. Then, in 1965, two Canadian researchers came forward with a revolutionary new theory of pain, the gate control theory, which is broadly accepted today. Pain, they contended, is registered through a gate in the spinal cord, a gate that can either be opened or closed, exposing the person to more or less pain. Things like depression, inactivity, and anxiety tend to open the pain gate wider, as does consciously focusing on the pain like I did that afternoon in hospital. Factors that close the pain gate include a positive outlook and being reassured that the pain is not harmful. Jan Palach's anxious pleas from his hospital bed for his letter to be read can therefore be understood not only as a dogged act of political will, but also, perhaps, as an instinctive act of pain mitigation. To think that his act of self-immolation had not been properly understood would only have compounded his agony.
This is the end of CD 12. The book continues on CD 13.